She was 101 years old when she died, and the country wept for her in the streets. The flowers came before the sun went down on the 30th of March, 2002. They came in their hundreds, and then their thousands, laid at the gates of Royal Lodge, Windsor, by people who had never met her, who had seen her only at a distance, on a television screen, in a newspaper photograph, at the end of a street when her car had passed, but who felt, with a certainty they would have struggled to fully explain, that something irreplaceable had left the world that afternoon. They kept coming, through the evening and through the night and into the days that followed. The queues formed to sign the books of condolence. The television broadcasts ran through the night and into the morning, and then through the following night. Presenters spoke in voices calibrated to the specific careful register that public grief demands, hushed but not melodramatic, sorrowful but composed, aware that the woman being mourned would have expected nothing less than composure from the people doing the mourning. The newspapers produced editions of unusual length and unusual depth. They drew on decades of accumulated material about a woman who had been a public figure since the 1920s, who had stood in the ruins of bombed streets during the Blitz and told the women of the East End that now she could look them in the face, who had smiled her particular focused smile at garden parties and race meetings and hospital visits and regimental dinners across 8 decades without that smile ever appearing to diminish or tire, who had been, for most of the people most of the time, the warmest and most approachable and most genuinely human face that the institution of the British monarchy had ever presented to its public. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. They described warmth that had never diminished with age, that had, if anything, deepened and concentrated as the decades accumulated, as the people around her aged and died and were replaced by younger people who encountered the warmth fresh and were affected by it, just as the previous generation had been affected. They described steadiness. That word appeared again and again, in editorial after editorial, in tribute after tribute. A steadiness that had been the foundation of something larger than any individual life, the institution she had served and shaped across the longest working life in the history of the British royal family. All of this was true. The service was real, the warmth was real, the steadiness was real. The tributes were not lies, they were also not complete. There was another version of this woman. It did not live in the editorials or the television tributes or the flowers at the gates of Royal Lodge. It lived in an Aberdeen house where a woman sat for 38 years without a visit. 38 years of silence maintained by an institution that had decided she no longer existed, applied by people she had loved and served and trusted across 17 years of daily life. It lived in the formal protocol of occasions where a duchess stood and waited for a curtsy that would never come, in rooms where the absence of 3 letters before her name communicated to everyone fluent in the language the institution spoke exactly what she was and what the institution had decided she would always be. It lived in an unmarked grave in Redhill, Surrey, where a woman had been buried without a stone to mark her passing, because the family that shared her blood had arranged, through the consistent and structural operation of its own priorities, for her to be absent from every record that the world consulted. It lived in a statement read aloud on the 31st of October, 1955, by a 25-year-old woman who had been brought, by the weight of family and institutional expectation, to a decision that would cost her something she would spend the next 47 years paying for, a debt extracted not in a single moment, but in the accumulated weight of every year that followed, every occasion that reminded her of what she had given up, every moment in which the life she had chosen felt less real than the life she had been prevented from living. It lived in letters that were burned in 1993, 4 years before their author died in a Paris tunnel, because the woman who burned them had been formed by a lifetime of institutional belonging into someone who understood that they were too dangerous to survive. This is the story of both versions, the version the country wept for in the streets, and the version that was never visible from the street. The version that produced the flowers at the gates, and the version that produced the silence in Aberdeen, and the grave in Redhill, and the ashes of the letters. The version that a nation loved, and the version that the people who experienced it could never quite make the nation believe. Hugo Vickers spent 17 years researching his biography of the Queen Mother. He observed her in public and in private across 4 decades. He conducted interviews with hundreds of people who had known her at various stages of her long life, read documents that were not available to the general public, sat with the contradictions and the complexities of a character that the official record had never been quite willing to address with the directness it deserved, and assembled what is, by general scholarly consensus, the most thorough independent account of her life and character that exists. He arrived, after all of that time and all of that observation, at a single phrase that he believed captured, more precisely than any other formulation he had encountered or constructed, the essential nature of the woman he had spent nearly 2 decades studying. The steel hand in the velvet glove. It was, he noted, a very good metaphor for how she conducted herself, able to turn the screws while smiling her winsome smile. This is what that phrase means. This is who it describes. And this is what it cost, paid, as the most important costs always are, not by the woman who wielded the hand, but by the people the glove made it invisible. This account is interested in both, in the hand and in the glove, in the warmth and in the steel, in the public version and the private version, and in what happens when you set them alongside each other, honestly, and ask what the full picture reveals. The full picture is more complicated than either version alone. It is also, if you are willing to look at it steadily, and without the protective distortions of sentimentality or reductiveness, more illuminating, because what it reveals is not merely the character of one woman, though it reveals that, and reveals it with a precision that the official account has always declined to match. What it reveals is the nature of the institution she served and shaped, and, in ways that outlasted her by decades, permanently altered. What it reveals is how power works when it is wielded without accountability, inside structures that have absorbed their own logic so completely that the logic feels like principle, and the consequences of the principle feel like justice. And the people on the receiving end of the consequences have no mechanism for making the people who imposed them understand that what has happened to them is not justice but its opposite. The flowers are real. The love is real. The century of service is real. The Aberdeen house is real. The unmarked grave is real. The burned letters are real. This is the story of all of it. Elizabeth Angela Marguerite Bowes-Lyon was born on the 4th of August, 1900, at the end of a century that had, more than any other in British history, defined what the aristocracy was and what it required of the people born into it. She entered a world that was, in the ways most relevant to her story, already beginning to shift beneath its own foundations. The great houses and the settled certainties of the late Victorian and Edwardian aristocracy were sustaining the last years of a confidence that 2 world wars would fundamentally transform. But she arrived early enough that the world she was born into could form her completely before its own transformation began, and the formation was so thorough that what it produced was a person who would spend a century inhabiting 2 worlds simultaneously, the world that was passing and the world that was arriving, with the serene composure of someone who had been built to navigate both. Her father was Claude George Bowes-Lyon, the 14th Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn. Her mother was Cecilia Nina Cavendish Bentinck. The family seat was Glamis Castle in Angus, Scotland, one of the oldest inhabited castles in Scotland, and a place whose particular atmosphere, ancient, history-saturated, embedded in the landscape of the Scottish East Coast in ways that made it feel less like a house than like a feature of the natural world, would remain one of her deepest personal associations across a century of her life. She would return to Scotland year after year, decade after decade, and she would eventually, in the years of her widowhood, rescue and restore the Castle of May in Caithness as a private testament to the attachment to the Scottish landscape that had been part of her formation from the beginning. She was the 9th of 10 children, a position in a large family that tends to produce, in people with her specific combination of intelligence and social instinct, the ability to read a room that comes from having always been slightly younger than most of the people in it, slightly less powerful than most of the people in it, and therefore necessarily more skilled at navigation than the people who occupied positions of acknowledged authority. The eldest child in a large family learns to command. The ninth child learns to persuade. She persuaded across a century of public life. She persuaded with a skill and a consistency that was the most remarkable single quality of an extraordinary character. The childhood at Glamis and at St. Paul's Waldenbury in Hertfordshire was, by her own later accounts, and by the accounts of the people who knew her during those years, genuinely happy. This is worth dwelling on, because it is the foundation of everything that follows. The warmth that the public would experience across a century of public engagement was not manufactured from a cold or a deprived or an unhappy base. It was grown in conditions of genuine affection and genuine security, in a family that was, by the standards of the aristocratic world it occupied, unusually warm and unusually attentive to the emotional lives of its children. She felt loved. She was loved. The capacity to make other people feel loved, which was the central instrument of her public life, was not a technique she acquired in order to produce a desired effect. It was a quality she had developed naturally, in conditions that had taught her what genuine love felt like and had given her both the experience and the temperament to produce it. The aristocratic world into which she was born had specific requirements of the women it produced. The requirements were not written down. They were transmitted, as all the most effective requirements are, through the consistent modeling of behavior by the people around you, through the immediate and legible social consequences of deviation, through the accumulated weight of an environment in which the correct way of being was simply the texture of daily life. The requirements included composure, the capacity to manage private feeling through public performance, to be in a room and contribute to the room without allowing what was actually happening inside you to become visible to the people around you. They included discretion, the understanding that certain things were private and that the definition of private was broad, much broader than most people outside this specific world would have drawn it, and that the obligation to maintain that privacy was total and permanent. They included the specific quality of attention that made guests feel welcome and valued and individually seen, a quality that the aristocratic world needed because it was the primary mechanism through which the social bonds that sustained its structure were maintained. She had all of these qualities. She had them naturally, in the sense that they were continuous with her personality, rather than imposed on it. She had them completely, in the sense that they did not waver or diminish under pressure. And she had them across a century, which is the sense in which she was, and remains without precedent. She did not marry into the royal family until she was 22 years old. She had, before that marriage, a life of considerable ordinariness within the specific constraints of her class and her moment, but ordinariness in the sense that she was a young woman who attended dances and maintained friendships and had interests and preferences and the ordinary texture of an inner life that had not yet been subordinated to any particular institutional purpose. The marriage to Prince Albert changed this completely. Not immediately. The transformation was gradual. The absorption of the institution's logic into her own was a process that took years, but completely in the sense that, by the time the transformation was finished, the woman who had arrived was no longer entirely distinguishable from the institution she had joined. The institution had made her into itself, and she had allowed and encouraged the making because she understood, with the clear-eyed intelligence that was one of the things she was most consistently underestimated for, that the institution was the thing that mattered, and that her own complete absorption into it was the price of the permanence it could offer. She had declined Albert's first proposal in 1921. She was 21 years old. The reasons she gave, that she was unsure about the life, that she was not certain she was suited to the demands it would impose, were not merely conventional hesitancy. They were, by all serious accounts, a genuine attempt to understand what she was being asked to accept. She had grown up in an aristocratic household that required significant self-subordination from the women in it, and she knew what self-subordination felt like and what it cost, and she wanted to be sure, before she committed to a life that would require it in much larger and much more permanent measure, that she was making the decision with her eyes open. She married him anyway in April 1923. The decision to marry him was a decision to become something. Not merely the wife of a prince, not merely the person who would occupy a particular social position and perform a particular public role. a decision to become, as completely and as permanently as it was possible for a person to become anything, the thing the institution required. She understood what this meant. The intelligence was there and had always been there, though it was frequently concealed by the warmth and the charm and the focus of the attention she directed at the people around her, concealed in the way that intelligence frequently is in people who have learned that being seen as intelligent is less useful than being seen as warm. The institution was not easy. The marriage was not easy in the way that marriages between people who are required to perform publicly while managing privately are never easy. But she made it work, made the marriage work, and made the public role work, and made the institution work, in the sense that the institution emerged from her decades of service to it stronger and more publicly trusted than it had been when she arrived. And she made it work by deploying the qualities she had brought to the institution fully and consistently across a century, and by accepting the costs that the deployment required without, so far as the available record shows, any significant public acknowledgement that the costs were real or that they deserved to be examined. The abdication of King Edward V on the 11th of December 1936 is the event that made her story what it was. It forced her husband onto a throne he had not expected to occupy and had not been prepared for. It imposed on him a burden that he carried with a loyalty and a dedication that the people around him found genuinely moving for the remaining 15 years of his life. It killed him, not immediately, not in a single dramatic moment, but incrementally, through the accumulated physical and psychological cost of doing a job he had never wanted, under pressures that a more prepared and more temperamentally suited person might have sustained, at a moment in history when the job required more than any previous version of it had required of any person in the role. He died in February 1952. He was 56 years old. She lived for 50 more years after his death. She lived them with the specific, particular weight of a woman who had watched someone she genuinely loved die from a burden that had been imposed on him by another person's choice, and who had spent those 50 years in the presence of the living reminder of that choice, who had watched the man responsible for the burden and the woman he had chosen over the institution continue to exist and continue to request and continue to advocate for the status that the institution and she had decided they would never receive. The steel that this produced was not manufactured from nothing. It was formed in the specific crucible of genuine grief, fused with the institutional logic she had absorbed so completely that it was no longer distinguishable from her own moral convictions, and hardened over 50 years of sustained application into something that was no longer quite grief or quite principle, but both at once, the personal and the institutional wound together into a single instrument that operated across 3 decades and more with a consistency and a thoroughness that is its own kind of remarkable. Before any of the specific stories can be properly understood, the code must be understood. Not as a written document, it was never written down, but because writing it down would have made it visible in ways that would have made it vulnerable to challenge, and the code depended absolutely on its own invisibility for its effectiveness. Not as a set of rules that anyone could have articulated in a clean and precise statement. As the unspoken system of requirements and prohibitions that governed life inside the institution, that had been maintained across generations by the consistent application of consequences to the people who violated it, and that had been so thoroughly absorbed by the people inside the institution that it felt not like a set of external constraints, but like the natural moral ordering of the world they inhabited. The code had a primary requirement above all others. It was the requirement that had formed the Queen Mother's instruction to Marion Crawford, that precise and absolute formulation, utterly oyster, and that she herself had embodied across her own public life with a thoroughness that was, even by the standards of the institution she served, exceptional. Keep the private private. The formulation is simple. Its implications are not. Keep the private private means that the domestic reality of the institution, the personalities, the tensions, the difficulties, the human specificities of the people inside it, is not to be shared with anyone outside it, not in publication, not in conversation, not in the kind of informal social disclosure that most people engage in naturally and without particular consideration. Because for most people, The sharing of information about the people around them is not a violation of a code, but simply the ordinary texture of social life. Inside the institution, it was a violation of the code, the most fundamental violation, the one that triggered the most severe and the most permanent consequences. Everything else in the code derived from this primary requirement. The warmth was permitted, was encouraged, was understood to be instrumentally necessary for the institution's public legitimacy, but the warmth had to be directed outward toward the public in ways that produced the desired perception without ever making the private reality of the people, producing it accessible. You could be charming, you could be focused, you could make every person you encountered feel individually seen and valued. You could not let that charm shade into the kind of genuine intimacy that produces the desire in the other person to know more, to be told more, to receive the disclosure of private information that genuine intimacy between people ordinarily involves. The warmth was permitted to be a door that appeared open and was, at the level of anything genuinely private, permanently locked. The composure was required even in the face of circumstances that would, in any other context, make composure the most unnatural and the most costly of responses. The spouse who is dying, the marriage that is failing, the personal humiliation that the institution's requirements have imposed, the grief that does not diminish with the performance of public duty. All of these had to be managed privately, processed privately, expressed only in the context that the institution had decided were appropriate, and the institution had decided that very few contexts were appropriate. The composure was not a mask that concealed the absence of genuine feeling. It was a discipline that required genuine feeling to be subordinated to the institutional requirement of public stability, consistently and without revision, for as long as the requirement continued to apply, which was always. The code's secondary requirement was permanence, not temporary discretion, not a period of appropriate silence followed by eventual disclosure. Permanent silence. The private remained private permanently. The silence, once established, was maintained without revision. The consequences, once applied, were not lifted in response to remorse, or to suffering, or to the passage of time, or to the kind of individual moral reasoning that might, in another context, produce the conclusion that the original decision had been disproportionate or unjust. This permanent quality of the code's enforcement was not accidental. It was functional. The deterrent force of the consequences depended on their being understood by the people inside the institution and by the people considering whether to violate it as permanent. If the consequences could be reversed, by waiting long enough, or by applying sufficient social pressure, or by the accumulation of sympathy for the individual suffering them, then the deterrent would be compromised. The person considering a violation would weigh the temporary pain of the consequences against the eventual possibility of their reversal. The institution could not afford this calculation. The deterrent required certainty. The consequences were certain. The silence was permanent. The code's third requirement was discretion in enforcement. The steel hand was not permitted to be visible. The mechanisms through which the code was enforced, the withdrawal of invitations, the silence to letters, the protocol manipulations, the denial of designations, the institutional management of information that complicated the approved account, had to be operated in ways that left the institution's public face entirely unaffected. The warmth directed at the general public had to remain consistent and genuine even while the mechanisms were operating against specific individuals. The pastel hat and the smile and the focused attention had to continue, unchanged, at the garden party, while the letter to the person in Aberdeen went unanswered. The gracious manner and the genuine warmth and the capacity to make each person feel individually valued had to be produced, with complete apparent sincerity, at the race meeting, while the decision about the HRH designation remained as immovable as it had been the previous decade and would remain the decade after. This is not hypocrisy in the ordinary sense. The warmth at the garden party was not manufactured to conceal the steel in Aberdeen, or rather, the fact that it was manufactured does not mean it was not genuine. The warmth was genuine, the steel was genuine. They were directed at different people for different purposes, and the ability to produce both simultaneously, without confusion or inconsistency, was not a moral failure but a form of competence. the specific competence the institution required, developed through decades of practice, in the woman who would become its most effective practitioner. The code also had an inheritance requirement. The people inside the institution were expected not only to observe the code themselves, but to transmit it to the next generations, to ensure that the people who would eventually inherit the institution's responsibilities understood, from the earliest possible stage, what those responsibilities required. This transmission was rarely explicit. It operated through the consistent embodiment of principle, rather than its articulation, through the modeling of the surface, so completely and so consistently across every situation that the next generation observed that the requirement entered them as absorbed understanding rather than stated rule. You did not tell the children that the private must remain private. You demonstrated it every day, in every interaction, in every choice about what to say and what not to say, and what to display, and what to keep behind the locked door of the composure that the institution required. Princess Margaret's burning of the letters in 1993 was this inheritance requirement in operation. She had been shaped by the institution as completely as her mother had been shaped by it, though with less success and at greater personal cost. She had watched the instruction being modelled. She had received it through 73 years of immersion in the environment that embodied it. She understood what the letters were, and what they might reveal, and what the institution required when faced with documentation that complicated the approved account. She made the decision the institution had always made when faced with this kind of situation, not because she had calculated that the decision was optimal, or because she had been instructed by anyone to make it, but because the institution had made her into someone who understood, at a level below conscious deliberation, that this was what the situation required. She burned them, and in burning them, she enacted one final time the code that had formed her, the code whose most fundamental requirement she had herself, on the 31st of October 1955, been the subject of its most personal application. The code also had a category of special severity. Not all violations were treated with equal consequence. The ordinary violations, the small indiscretions, the inadvertent disclosures, the failures of composure that could be attributed to inexperience or to the pressure of unusual circumstances, were managed with the institutional equivalent of a quiet correction, an indication sometimes unspoken of what was required, an opportunity to demonstrate by subsequent behavior that the correction had been received and absorbed. The severe violations, the ones that triggered the full weight of the institutional mechanism, were the violations that made the private publicly visible in ways that could not be contained or managed within the institution's existing information control structures. Marion Crawford's book was this kind of violation. Diana's cooperation with Andrew Morton was this kind of violation. The abdication itself, viewed from the institution's perspective, was this kind of violation in its most fundamental and most consequential form, the moment at which a private desire had been elevated above institutional requirement in the most public and the most irreversible way possible. For severe violations, the institution did not offer a correction or an opportunity for repair. It offered permanent consequences, applied without revision, maintained indefinitely by the people who had the standing and the will to maintain them. The standing was institutional, the position within the hierarchy that conferred the authority to act. The will was personal, the conviction, formed through decades of institutional formation, that what the consequences required was not cruelty but principle, and that the people on the receiving end of the principle were the authors of their own difficulty. The Queen Mother had both the standing and the will across 6 decades of institutional seniority. This is what made her the most effective enforcer of the code in the history of the modern British monarchy, and this combination, the standing to act and the will to sustain the action indefinitely, is what the people who experienced it found impossible to adequately describe to people who had not experienced it, because the standing made the enforcement look institutional, and the will made the enforcement feel impersonal, and the velvet made the enforcement, from the outside, look like nothing at all. Marion Crawford arrived at the royal household in 1932 as a 22-year-old Scottish schoolteacher who had been recommended, through the social connections of the Strathmores, as a suitable governess for the 2 young princesses. The position she was taking up was, by the standards available to a woman of her background and education in 1932, a remarkable opportunity, remarkable in the access it provided, remarkable in the trust it implied, remarkable in the way it placed her, overnight, at the very center of one of the most closely observed and most carefully protected domestic arrangements in the country. She was not naive about this. She understood, from the beginning, that she was entering a world with specific requirements and specific expectations, and that the access she was being given came with obligations that were not the ordinary obligations of employment. The ordinary obligations of employment, loyalty to the employer, discretion about workplace matters, professionalism in the execution of the work, were part of what was required of her. They were not the whole of what was required. What was required, beyond the ordinary obligations, was the specific form of total discretion that the institution applied to everyone who entered its inner circle, the understanding that what she saw and heard in the course of her work was not merely confidential in the normal professional sense but permanently private in the absolute institutional sense. She was entering the circle. The circle's rules were total. She stayed for 17 years. 17 years is a long time. Long enough for the 2 children she was employed to teach to grow from small girls. Elizabeth was 6 when Crawford arrived. Margaret was 2, into young women who had begun to occupy the public roles that their positions required of them. Long enough for Crawford herself to have accumulated a store of observation and experience and memory was, by any honest assessment, both historically significant and genuinely hers, in the way that the years of a person's life are genuinely theirs. Long enough for the affection between Crawford and the children she taught to become the kind of affection that does not distinguish itself easily from love, the deep, specific, accumulated affection of a person who has been present through years of development, who has been a constant in a life, who has contributed to the formation of the people she has accompanied. The affection was real on both sides. Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret were not children who withheld affection from the people who cared for them. They were, by all accounts, warm and responsive children who felt the quality of Marion Crawford's attention, the genuineness of her interest in them, the consistency of her presence, the seriousness with which she took their education and their well-being, and who returned that quality with the uncomplicated love of children who feel securely seen. Crawford described them, in the book that would eventually cost her everything, with the affection of someone writing about people she had genuinely loved. The description was accurate. The love was mutual. She did more than teach them. She pushed for them to have broader access to the world outside the palace than the conventional royal childhood involved. She took them on public transport, dressed in ordinary clothes, to experience the city as ordinary people experienced it. This was not a trivial contribution. The conventional royal childhood of the 1930s and 1940s was one of remarkable isolation from ordinary life, an isolation that was understood by the institution to be protective, but that had the additional effect of producing adults who had very limited direct experience of the world they were expected to represent. Crawford believed this was wrong, believed it with the conviction of someone who had thought seriously about education, and who understood that the capacity to represent a country required knowing something about the people who lived in it. She pressed for broader exposure, and she received it, imperfectly and within limits, but enough to be a meaningful contribution to the formation of 2 girls who would, between them, occupy the public life of the royal family for decades. The family valued her. This is stated clearly enough by the conditions of her employment. The Grace and Favour House in Kensington that was provided for her use, the terms of her service, the warmth of the communications she received from the people she served. The Queen Mother expressed warmth toward her in the way she expressed warmth toward most people in her orbit. Crawford felt, over the 17 years of her service, that she was known and genuinely valued, that the warmth directed at her was not merely professional courtesy but something more personal and more real. She was right about the warmth. The warmth was real. What she did not fully understand, until the moment it became visible, in the form of the silence that followed her book, was that the warmth and the code were not in contradiction with each other. The warmth was the velvet, the code was the steel. The warmth did not modify the code, or create an exception to it for people who had received significant quantities of it. It simply made the code invisible, made it impossible, from the inside of the warmth, to fully register that the code was there and that it was total and that it had no exceptions. She left the household in 1949 after her marriage to George Buthley. The departure was, by her account, reasonably amicable, an ending in good faith to a long and, she believed, mutually valued relationship. She retained the Grace and Favour house. She expected to remain in some form connected to the family whose children she had raised. She began, not immediately but in the period following her departure, to work on a book about her years in the household. A book she understood, apparently, as a warm and affectionate memoir of people she loved, not as a betrayal of the trust that had been placed in her. She had not understood the instruction. Utterly oyster. The instruction was not conditional. It did not apply only to material that was critical or damaging or likely to produce harmful consequences for the institution. It applied to all private material, without qualification, permanently and absolutely. The warmth she felt for the people she was writing about was not a mitigating factor. The genuine affection that suffused every page of the book was not a mitigating factor. The fact that the book contained nothing that a fair-minded person would describe as damaging to the institution was not a mitigating factor. The fact that it made the private visible was the only factor. The code required total discretion. The book was a total violation of total discretion. The consequences were total. The Little Princesses was published in 1950. It was serialized in an American magazine before its British publication. The specific detail that meant the institution had very limited ability to manage its impact before it was already in the public domain. The book was everything Crawford believed it was: warm, affectionate, admiring of the people it described, generous in its portrait of a household that had been, in her experience of it, humane and genuine in its care for the children it contained. It did not contain a single word that a hostile reader could have used to damage the institution or the people inside it. None of this mattered. The institution had one test, and one test only. Had the private been made visible? It had. The consequences were applied. They were applied with the precision and the thoroughness that characterized the institution's enforcement of the code at the level of severe violations. The communication stopped, not gradually, not with a period of cooling between the initial publication and the final silence, but immediately, the kind of immediate and total cessation of contact that communicates, without requiring any explicit statement, that a line has been crossed that will not be uncrossed. The letters that Crawford sent received no replies. The invitation ceased. The Grace and Favour house in Kensington was no longer available. She was relocated to Aberdeen. Aberdeen. The word is worth pausing on because it has a specific geography in the context of the relationship that had just been severed. The royal family spent significant portions of each summer and autumn at Balmoral, which is in Aberdeenshire, 40 miles west of Aberdeen on the road through Braemar. The route from London to Balmoral by road passes through or near Aberdeen. The route from Aberdeen to Balmoral passes through the same landscape. Marion Crawford settled, eventually, in a house that was, by her own account, approximately 200 yards from the road that the royal family's cars would use on the way to and from Balmoral each year. She was not visited. She was not acknowledged. The cars went past. For 38 years the cars went past. The period of time deserves to be held in the mind for a moment. 38 years is longer than most people's professional lives. It is longer than most marriages. It is the length of time between the end of the Second World War and 1983. It is the time required for a newborn child to grow into a middle-aged adult. It is, in the life of a person who is waiting for something to change and finding that it does not change, a span of time that must, in the living of it, have felt both endless and shapeless, days accumulating without the events that mark time as lived rather than merely endured, letters accumulating without the replies that would have confirmed they had been received, years accumulating without the acknowledgement that might have given the waiting a meaning beyond its own continuation. She sent letters, not in the immediate aftermath of the book's publication, when any contact would have been futile, but in the years that followed, in the periods when enough time had passed that hope, or what remained of hope, produced the attempt. She kept private papers. She maintained across the decades the belief that the truth was more complicated than the palace's account of it allowed, and she documented that belief in the papers she kept. She left those papers with her solicitor, with what one assumes was the understanding that they would eventually be available to the historians and journalists who would eventually need to reconstruct what had actually happened between her and the institution she had served. Marion Crawford died in 1988. She was 77 years old. She died in the Aberdeen house. She died with the silence still fully in place, not diminished, not softened by the passage of time, not interrupted by any form of acknowledgement or communication from the people whose childhood she had shaped. She died without the acknowledgement she deserved, without the restoration of the connection she had maintained the hope of restoring across 38 years of sustained and unanswered waiting. The Queen Mother was 88 years old when Marion Crawford died. She had 14 years of life remaining. She was, by every account of those years, as publicly warm and as focused and as apparently personally genuine in her engagement with the people around her as she had ever been. She was also, in the matter of Marion Crawford, exactly what she had been in 1950, silent. Not less silent because of the decades that had passed. Not less silent because Marion Crawford had died, and the silence could now only be broken retroactively, in the form of acknowledgement rather than renewed contact. Simply silent, with the settled completeness of a person for whom a decision has become so thoroughly part of the landscape that the possibility of its reversal is no longer present to consciousness. The silence had become by then simply part of the way things were, the institutional baseline from which any deviation would have required active effort, and toward which any deviation would eventually return. She did not deviate, she did not try. This is not sadism. This is not a description of a woman who took pleasure in the pain of another person, or who maintained the silence because the maintenance of it gave her satisfaction. What she felt, in all likelihood, was nothing in particular, which is the most precise description of how institutional cruelty operates. It is not maintained through active effort. It is maintained through the absence of the individual moral reasoning that would require the question to be asked. Is what is happening to this person proportionate to what this person did? The question was not asked because the framework she inhabited had no mechanism for asking it. The institution had decided. The decision was made on principle. The principle did not require revisiting, because principles do not require revisiting. Marion Crawford's 38 years in Aberdeen were the consequence of a principle, and the principle was sound, and that was the end of the matter. Except that it was not the end of the matter. The matter continued, as the matters that institutions decide they have concluded always continue, in the lives of the people to whom the institution's conclusions have been applied, in the papers kept by a woman in Aberdeen who believed the truth was more complicated than the palace's account, in the historians and journalists who would eventually piece together, from fragments that the institution had not managed to contain, a fuller account than the official silence had been designed to allow. Marion Crawford had told the truth about 2 children she loved. She paid for it with 38 years of silence in a city 2 hours from the people she had served. The flowers at Royal Lodge were still accumulating when her death in 1988 was already 14 years in the past, unmarked, unacknowledged, unreversed by the woman who had outlasted her by 14 years, and who had, across every one of those 14 years, continued to be received and loved by the public as the warmest and most genuinely human presence the institution had ever produced. The warmth was genuine, the silence was also genuine. Both were real, both were consistent, both were maintained across the full century of the woman who embodied them. There is something specific that deserves to be said about the nature of the hope that Marion Crawford maintained across those 38 years, because the hope is part of the story, and it illuminates something about the way the velvet operates on the people who have experienced it as warm, before they experience it as the surface concealing the steel. She had received the warmth, not as a member of the public who had encountered it at a garden party or a race meeting, mediated through the specific conditions of a public occasion. The crowd, the performance context, the understood distance between the public figure and the individual in the crowd. She had received it as someone in daily proximity, in the domestic intimacy of a household over 17 years. She had received it from people whose children she had taught to read, whose mornings she had been present for, whose private character she had observed in the unguarded moments that domestic proximity produces. The warmth she had received was, in its specific register, the most genuine form the warmth took. The warmth not directed at the public, but at a person the family knew and valued and had reason to love. And she had received it for 17 years, 17 years of that warmth, 17 years of the focused attention and the apparent genuine interest and the specific quality of being known that the Queen Mother directed at the people in her immediate orbit with the same consistency and the same apparent sincerity that she directed the public warmth at the people in the crowds. This is why she sent the letters. This is why she maintained the hope across a decade and then 2 decades and then 3 decades of unreturned letters and unacknowledged proximity, because the warmth she had experienced was real, because real warmth, in the experience of most people, does not simply cease, because the assumption that real warmth once given can be withdrawn permanently and completely, with no residue and no revision, and no eventual reassertion of itself against the principle that has replaced it. This assumption runs so counter to ordinary human experience that it requires, for most people, the sustained evidence of exactly what Marion Crawford received across 38 years before it becomes fully credible. She believed, for years that became decades, that the warmth would reassert itself, that the principle would eventually be weighed against the human reality of the woman in the Aberdeen house and found at some point to have been applied with sufficient severity, and that the application would be recognized as complete and the silence would end. She was wrong. The principle did not have that kind of internal limit. The institution that had produced the principle had no mechanism for recognizing that a principle once applied had produced enough consequence. The principle was simply the principle, applied permanently, without the kind of individual moral reasoning that would have asked whether the 38 years were proportionate to the book. She was wrong, and she died wrong, died without the acknowledgement she had been waiting for, died with the silence still in place, died in the Aberdeen house, 2 hours from the people whose silence had put her there. The warmth was genuine. The silence was also genuine. Both were real. Both were consistent. Both were maintained across the full century of the woman who embodied them. That this is possible, that a person can be genuinely warm and genuinely capable of sustained, indefinite, irrevocable silence applied to a specific individual who experienced the warmth and trusted it, is one of the most precise things that the steel hand in the velvet glove describes. The velvet is not a disguise, the steel is not a hidden truth, they are both the truth, simultaneously, in the same person, deployed with equal consistency in their respective directions. The Duke of Windsor, Edward, the man who had been King Edward V for 326 days before his abdication on the 11th of December 1936, spent the remaining 36 years of his life in a kind of exile that was not quite geographical, not quite social, but deeply and precisely institutional. He lived primarily in France, in a house in the Bois de Boulogne in Paris, with the woman whose love had cost him a throne and whose institutional status, specifically, the 3 letters that would have been placed before her name if she were HRH, and that were not placed before her name because the institution had decided they would not be, became, across 36 years, the most persistent and the most symbolically freighted grievance in the modern history of the British royal family. He died in Paris on the 28th of May 1972 at the age of 77 of throat cancer. He had been ill for some time. His health had been declining through the winter and spring, and by May the end was clearly approaching. Queen Elizabeth II had visited him 10 days before his death. He had been brought downstairs in his dressing gown to receive her, brought down from the room in which he was dying, in the house that he and the Duchess had occupied for years, to receive a niece who had become the sovereign of the country he had once been prepared to rule. The visit was conducted with the formal courtesy and the personal warmth that the Queen was capable of producing on occasions the institution required it, the warmth that was the institution's most reliable public instrument, and that the institution deployed in such situations with the same consistency that it deployed everything. It was conducted also in the specific shadow of the thing he had been asking for across the preceding 36 years. The thing that he had raised in the final conversation he was lucid enough to sustain with a member of his family, the request that was at its core the simplest and the most human of requests, that the woman he loved, the woman whose love he had chosen over everything else in his life, be given the recognition that her marriage to a former King of England might, in any other set of circumstances, have been expected to produce as a matter of course. His wife was not made HRH. The HRH designation, Her Royal Highness, is in the formal protocol of the British royal family, a designation that confers a specific and publicly visible form of institutional recognition. It determines the manner in which the person who holds it is addressed, the protocol that governs the interactions between them and other members of the family, the standing they occupy in the institutional hierarchy. For the Duchess of Windsor, who occupied a position adjacent to the royal family by virtue of her marriage to the Duke, the question of the HRH was the question of whether she was institutionally fully inside the circle or merely adjacent to it, tolerated, acknowledged, present on occasions when her presence was unavoidable, but positioned in every formal room in which the question could arise, as a degree below. The letters patent issued at the time of the abdication in December 1936 established the Duke's title as Duke of Windsor and specified that while the title could theoretically pass to his descendants, the HRH prefix would be limited to him alone. This was not a neutral bureaucratic decision. It was a decision taken by an institution that understood the significance of the designation and that had decided, in the specific circumstances of the abdication and the marriage that followed, that Wallis Simpson would not receive it. The Queen Mother was widely understood by the people with direct knowledge of the institution's internal dynamics to have been the primary force maintaining this denial across 3 reigns and 3 decades. This is not a matter of inference or speculation. It is the consistent assessment of people who were present in the relevant conversations, who understood the internal politics of the household, and who have described their understanding in sufficiently consistent terms across sufficiently varied sources to be taken seriously. The denial was maintained not merely by inertia or by the unchallenged perpetuation of a decision once made. It was maintained against active and repeated challenges raised in every available forum across 36 years by a woman who had decided what the institution required on this specific question and who had the standing and the will to ensure that what she had decided was maintained. What did Wallis Simpson do to earn this? In the institution's understanding of the matter, the answer was straightforward and in a certain limited sense also complete. She had been the means by which a man had chosen his personal happiness over the institution's requirements. She was not merely a person whom the institution disliked, though the dislike was real and was documented in accounts of private conversations that were contemporary with the events they described. She was the lived, continued, visible embodiment of the choice that had imposed on George VI the burden that had killed him at 56. Every year that Wallis Simpson continued to exist, continued to be present on the occasions when the Duke's presence was unavoidable, continued to occupy the space in which the question of her HRH would inevitably arise, was a year in which the choice and its consequences were kept in living, present view. The personal and the institutional were fused in the Queen Mother's response to the Windsors in a way that was, as with all the most effective fusions of personal conviction and institutional logic, genuinely indistinguishable. She did not experience her sustained opposition to the HRH as personal vindictiveness because she did not, by the time the opposition had been maintained across a decade or 2 decades or 3 decades, any longer have access to the personal feeling that had originally contributed to it. It had become principle. It had become the obvious and natural way things were. It had become part of the institutional landscape in the same way that the silence in Aberdeen had become part of the institutional landscape, not actively maintained but simply present, the default position from which any deviation would have required active effort. The Duke understood this. He understood it with the clarity of someone who has spent 30 years attempting to change a position and who has learned, through 30 years of failure, that the position is not going to change. He raised the question with his brother, King George VI, who was sympathetic in the manner of a man who is sympathetic to a cause. He understands he does not have the power to advance against the opposition of the people whose opposition he understands. He raised it with his niece, Queen Elizabeth II, who was sympathetic in the manner of a woman who understood the personal dimensions of the question, and who also understood the institutional dimensions in ways that made the resolution her uncle wanted unavailable to her, without costs she was not prepared to pay. He raised it with successive prime ministers, who were sympathetic in the manner of politicians who have learned to be sympathetic to requests they are not going to fulfill. He raised it from his deathbed in the last conversation he was capable of sustaining with a member of the family he had once stood to lead. None of it moved the position. The position did not move because the position was not movable, not because it lacked the votes or the institutional authority to be moved, but because the woman whose conviction was its primary source was a woman for whom the revisiting of a decision meant the acknowledgement that the decision might have been wrong, and that acknowledgement was precisely the thing the institution's code made impossible. The Duchess of Windsor wrote, in her memoir, that the Queen Mother's charm was justly famous. The phrase is worth dwelling on. She did not say the charm was false. She did not say it was a performance devoid of genuine feeling. She said it was justly famous, which means she acknowledged the quality of the charm, the genuine quality of it, the way in which it was real and was recognized to be real, precisely because it was real. What the phrase communicates, in the context of everything else the memoir contains and everything else the life of the woman writing it represents, is not a compliment. It is a precise and carefully delivered observation. I know exactly what this charm is. I know what it covers and I know what it has been used to conceal. I am not fooled by it. But I also know that it is real, because I have encountered it, and because encountering it is one of the most disorienting experiences available to a person who has also experienced what it covers. The sarcasm was thin enough to cut with. The Duchess outlived her husband by 14 years. She died in April 1986 in the Paris house in the Bois de Boulogne, attended by the staff who had remained with her through the long, increasingly isolated years of her widowhood. She was never given the HRH. She died in the adjacent but lesser position that the institution had established for her in 1937, and that had been maintained across 50 years by the force of a conviction that felt from the inside like principle and that felt from the outside like a sustained and implacable campaign whose proportionality to the original transgression was something that no one inside the institution had any mechanism for questioning. The Queen Mother outlived the Duchess by 16 years. She did not use those 16 years to produce any posthumous resolution. The posthumous resolution would have required the acknowledgement that a decision, once made on principle and maintained for 50 years, might have been disproportionate. The institution had no mechanism for that acknowledgement. The woman who had been its most consistent practitioner had no access to that acknowledgement. The denial had become, like the silence in Aberdeen, simply part of the landscape, the way things were. She died, the Duchess, without the recognition she had been denied for 50 years. She was buried at Frogmore, beside the Duke who had chosen her over the throne, who had spent 36 years asking for something that was not given, and who had died asking for it and had not received it even then. Two people, a marriage, and 50 years of sustained institutional exclusion applied by the woman who understood, better than almost anyone, the relationship between the performance of warmth and the love it produced, and who understood, equally well, the relationship between the enforcement of principle and the permanence of consequences. The Duke of Windsor died asking for something that was not given. The Duchess of Windsor died having never received what her position might, in any other version of this story, have entitled her to expect. The Queen Mother died having maintained the denial across 6 decades without a single degree of revision, without a single concession to the argument that 60 years of consistent application might, at some point, be considered sufficient, without a single moment in which the institutional logic that had produced the denial was subjected to the individual moral reasoning that might have asked whether it was proportionate. The velvet was for the crowds. The steel was for the people who had crossed the line. The Windsors had crossed the line in 1936. They crossed it only once. They paid for it every day for the next 36 years, and then, in the Duchess's case, for 14 years more. It is worth, before leaving this story, considering what the exile actually looked like from inside it. Not the formal exile of a legal sentence, not the exile of a person who has been expelled from their country and who faces clearly defined conditions for potential return, but the specific and structurally ambiguous exile of two people who were still present, still in the world, still able to visit Britain on occasion, and to attend the public occasions that their position entitled them to attend, but who were positioned, in every room in which the relevant protocol applied, as permanently adjacent to the circle rather than inside it. This form of exile is in certain respects harder to endure than the clean-edged exile of total exclusion, because total exclusion at least provides the clarity of a defined situation. The Windsor's situation was not clearly defined. It was perpetually negotiated, perpetually subject to the small protocol decisions that communicated, at each individual occasion, that the positioning had not changed and would not change. Every visit to Britain produced the encounter with the family. Every encounter with the family produced the moment, the curtsy that Wallis Simpson did not receive, the deference that was not owed to her, the specific and repeated communication that she occupied the place the institution had decided she occupied, and that the decision had not been revisited. The Duke understood this completely. He had been born inside the circle, and he understood, with the specific and painful clarity of someone who has lived inside a system and is then positioned outside it, exactly what the curtsy meant and what its absence communicated. He raised the question repeatedly, not because he was naive about the likelihood of success, but because the raising of it was the only form of resistance available to him, the only way to communicate to the institution and to the historical record that the positioning was experienced as unjust and that the person it was imposed on had not accepted it as just. The institution's response, maintained across 36 years and then across the 14 years of the Duchess's widowhood, was to receive the raising of the question and to not answer it, or to answer it in the form that the institution always used for questions it had decided not to address, which was the continuation of the existing position without the acknowledgement that a question had been asked. The denial was maintained. The question was recorded somewhere in the correspondence files of the palace, alongside the absence of any response that acknowledged its legitimacy. The people who had asked it died. The denial outlasted them. This is the specific and complete form of institutional power applied to individuals who have no institutional standing from which to challenge it, the power to simply continue, unchanged and without explanation, until the individuals who are subject to the decision have run out of the time and the health and the life required to keep raising it. The Duke ran out, the Duchess ran out, the denial continued. The Queen Mother outlived them both. She outlived the Duke by 30 years. She outlived the Duchess by 16 years. She used none of those years to produce the resolution the Duke had spent his life requesting. She died with the denial intact, as she had maintained it, as the institution she had shaped would continue to maintain it, for as long as the maintenance served the purpose the institution had decided it served. There is a story embedded in the public record of the Queen Mother's life that the official accounts have never fully absorbed, a story that sits in the documentary record like a stone that has been placed face down so that the inscription is invisible to the people who walk past it. It is a story about two women whose existence was not publicly acknowledged for decades, whose names were listed as deceased in authoritative reference documents while they were alive, whose institutional care was maintained across 6 decades without documented contact from the family that shared their blood, and whose deaths, one in 1986, one in 2014, passed without public acknowledgement from the royal family in either case. The women's names were Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon. They were the daughters of John Herbert Bowes-Lyon, the 5th and youngest son of the 14th Earl of Strathmore, the Queen Mother's brother. Nerissa was born on the 25th of February 1919. Catherine was born on the 4th of July 1926. Both were, from birth or from the earliest years of their development, severely cognitively disabled, to a degree that placed them, in the medical and social understanding of the era into which they were born, in the category of people for whom independent life was not considered a realistic prospect, and for whom long-term residential care was both standard medical recommendation and the standard social provision for families of any means. The decision to place them in institutional care was made in 1941. They were placed in the Royal Earlswood Hospital in Redhill, Surrey, a long-term care institution for people with intellectual disabilities, established in the Victorian era. That was, by the standards of 1941, a respected facility, not a place of deliberate cruelty or deliberate neglect. It is important to be precise about this, but a place operating according to the assumptions of an era that regarded intellectual disability as something to be managed and contained within institutional structures, rather than supported within family and community life, and that produced, as those assumptions always produce, outcomes that subsequent generations have recognized as inadequate and harmful, regardless of the good intentions of the people who implemented them. Nerissa and Catherine remained in the institution and in successor facilities on the same site for the remainder of their lives. They were there throughout the Blitz, the years in which their aunt was standing in bombed streets and making herself the embodiment of wartime, courage and human solidarity. They were there through the coronation of 1953, through the garden parties and the race meetings, and the decades of public warmth that were building the love the country would feel on the 30th of March 2002. They were there through the long years of the Queen Mother's widowhood, through the Castle of May and the Cheltenham racing seasons, and the lunches at Clarence House, and the birthday portraits on the 4th of August. They were there for 61 years, in Nerissa's case, and for 73 years in Catherine's. Nerissa died on the 22nd of January 1986. She was 66 years old. She was buried in the grounds of the institution at Redhill Cemetery. The grave was unmarked, not marked by the institution, not marked by the family, simply unmarked in the way that graves of people whose family connections had no visible presence in the life of the person who died are sometimes unmarked through the absence of anyone who understood it as their responsibility to mark them. Catherine lived until the 22nd of February 2014. She was 87 years old. She had been in institutional care for 73 years, longer than most people's entire adult lives. Their existence was known to the family. The specific form in which this is established is worth examining carefully, because it matters to the assessment of what happened subsequently. Burke's Peerage, the authoritative genealogical reference volume for British aristocracy, the work that has maintained the dynastic records of the British upper classes across generations, the source to which historians and journalists and interested members of the public turn when they need to know who is related to whom in the world. Of the aristocracy included Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon in its 1963 edition. It listed them as deceased. They were not deceased. They were alive. Nerissa would live for another 23 years after the 1963 edition. Catherine would live for another 51. They were alive in the Surrey institution, and the record said they were dead, and the correction was not made across the 24 years between the 1963 edition and the public revelation of their existence in 1987. The correction was not made because no one in a position to make it chose to make it. This is the simple fact of the matter. Burke's Peerage does not maintain its own independent records. It compiles information provided by or available from the families it documents. The information that Nerissa and Catherine were deceased was, in all probability, either provided by the family or accepted as accurate by the compilers, because no correction was forthcoming from the family. The correction would have been straightforward to make. The correction was not made. The journalist Royston Ellis discovered the truth in 1987 through the kind of investigative work that involves checking institutional records against published genealogical documentation and following the discrepancies to their source. His reporting produced an account that was, for the people who had followed the Queen Mother's public life with ordinary interest, genuinely shocking, not because the existence of disabled family members is shameful, but because the combination of elements that the reporting revealed amounted to something that was difficult to explain within the framework of ordinary privacy or ordinary discretion. The elements were 2 women who shared the Queen Mother's blood, placed in institutional care in 1941, with no documented contact from the royal family across the following decades, listed as deceased in an authoritative public reference source that no one had corrected for 24 years, buried, in Nerissa's case, in an unmarked grave. None of these elements is individually easily explicable as ordinary family privacy. Together, they constitute something more specific, a systematic and sustained management of an inconvenient reality through the mechanism of sustained absence. The absence of contact, the absence of acknowledgement, the absence of the correction that would have made the record accurate. The palace's response, when it eventually came, was to acknowledge the placements while contextualizing them within the medical and social attitudes of the time. The contextualization was not dishonest. The placement of severely disabled family members in long-term residential care was not unusual by standards of 1941. The attitudes toward intellectual disability that produced such placements were general rather than specific to the Bowesleyan family or the royal family. They were the attitudes of a class and an era that has since been recognized as both incorrect and harmful, but they were not exceptional. The contextualization does not explain what the contextualization cannot explain. It explains the placement. It does not explain the correction that was not made to Burke's peerage across 24 years. It does not explain the absence of documented contact across 6 decades. It does not explain the unmarked grave. These things are not explained by the general social attitudes of 1941, because the general social attitudes of 1941 did not require families to list living members as deceased in public reference documents, did not require families to maintain 6 decades of non-contact, did not require graves to go unmarked. What they are explained by is the specific institutional logic that governed the management of private information about the royal family and the families connected to it. The private must remain private, the surface must remain smooth. The things that would disturb the surface, the uncomfortable, the inconvenient, the things that complicated the narrative of a family committed to public service and public warmth, must be managed through sustained and structural absence, not through cruelty, not through deliberate harm to the specific individuals involved, but through the simple and systematic maintenance of the conditions under which those individuals remained invisible. They were invisible. They were in Surrey, 2 hours from London, for 61 and 73 years respectively, and they were invisible. Not invisible in the way that private people whose lives do not intersect with the public record are invisible. Invisible in the specific and deliberate way that the institutional logic of the code produced when it encountered a reality that the surface could not accommodate. The Queen Mother was alive throughout all of it. She was alive when Nerissa and Catherine were placed in the Surrey Institution in 1941. She was alive when Burke's peerage listed them as deceased in 1963, and she was alive for the 24 years in which that listing remained uncorrected. She was alive when Nerissa died in 1986 without a family member present, in the institution in which she had spent 61 years and was buried in an unmarked grave. She was still alive at the age of 101 when she herself died in 2002, by which point Catherine had been in institutional care for 61 years and would remain there for another 12. In all of those years, there is no documented evidence of a visit, no documented evidence of a letter, no documented evidence of any form of private acknowledgement, not even the private acknowledgement that would have cost nothing publicly but would have communicated to 2 women in a Surrey institution that the family that shared their blood knew they were there and had not entirely forgotten them. The grave in Redhill was eventually marked. It was not marked by the family. This is the steel in its most passive form, not active cruelty, not the deliberate application of consequences to a specific person who has committed a specific transgression. Passive cruelty, the simple, sustained decades-long withholding of acknowledgement from 2 women whose existence was inconvenient in the specific institutional sense of being, the kind of reality that the code required the surface to not contain. The inconvenience was not dangerous. It was not a threat. It was simply a fact that did not fit the narrative, and the narrative was the thing that mattered, and the thing that did not fit the narrative was managed across 6 decades through the most efficient form of management available, the maintenance of its absence. The contrast with the public version of her life is worth holding in the mind for a moment, not as a rhetorical device designed to produce a particular emotional response, but as a factual juxtaposition that carries its own weight. The Queen Mother's public identity was built, in significant part, on the specific claim of human solidarity, the claim enacted in the bombed streets of the East End, the claim expressed in the remark about now being able to look the East End in the face, the claim embodied in the quality of attention she directed at people who were suffering and who felt, in receiving that attention, that their suffering was genuinely seen. The claim was real, the attention was genuine, the solidarity was not manufactured. It was also applied selectively. The women in the Surrey institution were not in the bombed streets of the East End. They were in an institution too, hours from London, sharing the blood of her brother, unreachable not because of geography or circumstance, but because the institutional logic she had absorbed required their absence from the surface, and the surface was the thing that the claim of solidarity served, and the things that complicated the surface were the things that the claim of solidarity could not accommodate. This is not an argument that the solidarity was false. It is an argument that the solidarity operated within the framework of the code, and the code defined its boundaries. The code defined who was inside and who was outside, not always explicitly, not always through deliberate decisions about specific cases, but through the accumulated logic of an institution that had always organized its presentation of itself around a certain kind of warmth directed outward and a certain kind of management applied to the things that would complicate the outward warmth. Nerissa and Catherine were outside, not as a decision made about them specifically, as the product of the code operating in the way the code always operated, by maintaining the absence of the things that did not fit indefinitely, without requiring any active effort to maintain it, until the absence became simply part of the landscape, and the landscape became simply the way things were. They were in Surrey. They were there for decades. They were there when the flowers accumulated at the gates of Royal Lodge on the 30th of March 2002, and they were not among the things that the people laying the flowers were thinking about. Princess Margaret Rose was born on the 21st of August 1930, the younger daughter of the Duke and Duchess of York, and she grew up in the specific condition, specific to the royal family, specific to the kind of family in which one child will inherit the world and another will occupy a permanent position in its orbit, of being the daughter of a king and the sister of a queen, which is a position of extraordinary proximity to power and extraordinary distance from it. Simultaneously, she was at the center of everything. She would inherit nothing. She was raised for a life of public service and public warmth and public composure and private subordination to the institutional requirements of the family she had been born into, and she was raised for it by the woman who had defined, more completely than anyone else in the institution's modern history, what that life looked like and what it required. She was her mother's daughter in the ways that made her charming and the ways that made her difficult. The charm was genuine, and it was the same kind of charm, the social intelligence, the capacity for focused attention, the ability to make people feel individually seen and valued, that her mother had developed and deployed across a century of public engagement. Margaret had it in full measure, and she had it with an additional quality of vitality and spontaneity that made it, in social context, perhaps even more immediately attractive than her mother's version. Less controlled, more instinctive, more likely to produce in the people who experienced it the feeling of genuine, unguarded connection, rather than the feeling of warmth that had been carefully and consistently produced across a lifetime. She was also her father's daughter in ways that her charm sometimes concealed. King George VI was a man of genuine feeling and genuine vulnerability. The stammer that he spent years overcoming was not merely a speech impediment, but a visible expression of the specific tension between the intensity of his inner life and the demands of his public role, a tension that the institution required him to manage, but that never entirely resolved. Margaret shared this quality, the intensity of feeling, the gap between what was experienced privately and what the institution required to be expressed publicly, and she experienced it in the specific, form available to a person who has her mother's social intelligence, but not her mother's capacity for the total, permanent, no exception maintenance of the surface. She fell in love with Group Captain Peter Townsend in the early 1950s. The dating of the beginning of the relationship is somewhat uncertain. The public record tends to place it in the years after her father's death in 952, but people who were close to the family in the preceding years have suggested that the attachment had developed earlier, in the final years of King George VI's life, when Townsend was the king's equerry and therefore a daily presence in the household. Townsend was 16 years older than Margaret. He was, by all accounts that are available, a man of considerable personal quality, brave, intelligent, loyal, genuinely decent in the way that the people who worked alongside him during and after the war consistently described. He had been one of the Battle of Britain's fighter aces. He had served the king with a dedication and a personal devotion that the king had valued and expressed. He was not a man whose character was unknown to the family. He was known, and what was known of him was, by any honest assessment, admirable. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. He was divorced. The divorce had been granted on grounds of his wife's adultery. He was, in the available legal and moral categories, the innocent party. The Church of England did not, at that time, make effective distinctions between innocent parties and guilty parties in the matter of divorce and remarriage. The fact of the divorce was the fact that mattered. The Church's position was the position that mattered. The Queen was supreme governor of the Church. The Church's position was the Queen's constitutional position. The constitutional position was the institutional position. The institutional position was the code. The relationship became publicly known in June 1953. At the coronation, when the journalist who observed Margaret removed the piece of lint from Townsend's uniform, understood immediately, from the quality of the gesture, the unself-consciousness of it, the naturalness of it, the way it communicated a familiarity that was entirely different from the familiarity of a colleague, what the relationship between these two people actually was. The press, having understood it, pursued it with the thoroughness that the British press brought to royal stories of this kind, and the pursuit produced public knowledge that the palace was then required to manage rather than suppress. The management took the form of removing Townsend from the household. He was posted as air attaché to Brussels in the summer of 1953, and establishing the conditions under which Margaret and Townsend would be prevented from seeing each other for a period sufficient for the relationship to cool or for the public attention to it to diminish. The conditions were maintained for 2 years. They did not produce either of the outcomes the management had been designed to produce. When Townsend returned from Brussels in 1955, the relationship was as it had been before his departure, and the public attention to it was, if anything, more rather than less intense for the 2 years of separation. The question of what would happen reached its formal resolution in October 1955. The newspapers had been building toward a specific date, the 21st of August 1955, Margaret's 25th birthday, the date on which, under the Royal Marriages Act, she would no longer require the sovereign's permission to marry. The date passed without a formal announcement. The attention continued. The decision continued to be required. The Queen Mother's role in the events of October 1955 is one of the places where the available record is most incomplete, and where the destroyed correspondence, the letters that Princess Margaret burned in 1993, might have provided the most illuminating documentation. What is available from the public record is consistent with the account of a woman who understood the institutional requirements of the situation and who communicated those requirements to her daughter in the manner she communicated all requirements, through the warmth that was genuine and through the expectation that was total and through the institutional logic that had no mechanism for acknowledging that what it required might be disproportionate to the person being required to pay for it. The choice that was presented to Margaret was a genuine choice in the specific limited sense that she was not physically compelled to make one decision rather than another. She could marry Townsend. The consequences of marrying him were renunciation of her place in the line of succession, forfeiture of her civil list income, a permanent repositioning from the centre of the institutional circle to its edge. These consequences were not trivial. They were, in 1955, with the Queen's children still very young, and the succession therefore not entirely certain, significant. And they were, more importantly, the kind of consequences that the institution imposed on people who chose personal happiness over institutional requirement. The kind of consequences that communicated, in the language the institution spoke, that the choice was being registered and that its cost would be permanent. She made the statement on the 31st of October 1955. She was 25 years old. She cited the Church's teaching that Christian marriage is indissoluble and her duty to the Commonwealth. She used the language that the institution had always used for the moments when it required its members to pay the costs that membership imposed. The language was the language of choice, of freely chosen sacrifice, of principle accepted rather than imposed, of duty embraced rather than enforced. This is always the language the institution uses for these moments, because the institution cannot operate in the language of compulsion without making visible the compulsion, and the visibility of the compulsion would undermine the institution's claim to be the kind of body whose requirements are embraced rather than endured. The language of free choice serves the institution's account of itself. Whether the choice was genuinely free, in any meaningful sense that goes beyond the absence of physical coercion, is a different question, and it is a question that the people who made the statement and the people who shaped the conditions in which the statement was made were not in a position to answer honestly. The steel hand leaves no fingerprints that the person it grips is willing to display. Margaret displayed none. She used the language of free choice, and she lived with the consequences, and she did not, as far as available record shows, ever publicly attribute the consequences to the institutional pressure that had produced them, or to the mother, whose absorption of that pressure was the primary reason for its effectiveness. She married Anthony Armstrong Jones in May 1960. The marriage was genuinely happy in its early years and genuinely difficult in its later years, and it ended in divorce in July 1978, the first royal divorce since the abdication crisis. She lived for another 24 years after the divorce, years of public service and social vivacity, and the specific kind of dignified endurance that people who have been formed by institutions that do not acknowledge pain have available to them. She died in February 2002, 6 weeks before the mother who had formed her, who had shaped the institution that had shaped her, who had demonstrated across a century the art that Margaret had been required to learn and that she had never quite managed to practice with her mother's complete consistency. The cost of October 1955 is not recoverable from the historical record. What the historical record contains is the statement and the date and the name of the man she did not marry. It does not contain the 47 years that followed, experienced from the inside. It does not contain the weight that the people who knew her well recognized and that they attributed, consistently and across the decades, to the specific decision of that specific date. There is something that deserves to be said about the specific cruelty of this form of institutional enforcement. The form that operates not through the imposition of consequences for a transgression, but through the management of a choice in ways that produce the required outcome while maintaining the fiction of free agency. The institution did not punish Princess Margaret for choosing Peter Townsend. It communicated, through the conditions it established and the language it used and the requirements it made legible without ever stating them directly, that the choice the institution required was the one she would make if she was the person the institution had made her, and she was the person the institution had made her, and she made that choice. The specific cruelty is that she could never, within the framework the institution provided, attribute the making of the choice to anything other than her own convictions. The language of duty and faith and freely chosen sacrifice was the language the institution gave her for the moment, and the language was internally consistent with everything the institution had taught her about what she was and what she owed, and the internal consistency made it impossible to locate, from inside the framework, the point at which the teaching had produced the result the institution required. She had been formed, The formation was complete. The choice was made. It was her choice. The institution had nothing to do with it, except that the institution had everything to do with it. The institution had spent 25 years making her into someone who would make this choice in this moment. It had done this through the modeling of the woman who was her mother, through the daily immersion in the values and the requirements of the code, through the absorption of the understanding that certain things mattered more than personal happiness, and that the mattering was not an external imposition but an internal conviction. It had done this so thoroughly that the conviction was genuine, genuinely hers, genuinely felt, genuinely the expression of what she actually believed about duty and faith and what her life was for. And the conviction cost her 47 years. The steel hand leaves no fingerprints, but the grip is visible if you look, in the life that was lived in the years after the grip was applied, in the specific weight that the people who knew her attributed to the October 195 decision, in the quality of the years that followed, in the woman she was at the end of her life, which was not the woman she might have been if the institution had offered her the choice the institution told her she had freely made. Princess Diana married Prince Charles on the 29th of July 1981. The global audience for the wedding was estimated at approximately 750 million people. She wore a dress with a 25-foot train. The streets of London were lined with hundreds of thousands of people who had come to see the carriage pass and who felt, in seeing it, that they were witnessing something that expressed something real about the country and the institution and the moment. She was 19 years old. She was, by all serious accounts of the people who knew her then, both excited and frightened, excited by the scale and the significance of what was happening, and frightened by the scale and the significance of what was happening, in the way that 19-year-olds are frequently simultaneously excited and frightened by things that are larger than their previous experience of the world. She was unprepared for what she was entering. This is established by enough sources, across enough time and enough distance from the events themselves, to be taken as accurate. Not unprepared in the sense of uninformed about the formal requirements of royal life. She had been briefed, she had been prepared, she had been given the information that the institution understood as the relevant information for someone entering her position. Unprepared in the sense of not having been equipped with what the formal briefings could not provide, an understanding of what it would actually feel like to live inside an institution that had no mechanism for responding appropriately to the kind of person she was. The institution had no mechanism because the institution had spent a century developing mechanisms for a specific kind of person, the person who could do what the Queen Mother had spent she demonstrating it was possible to do. The person who could separate private feeling from public performance so completely and so consistently that the surface was always available, always smooth, always projecting the warmth and the composure and the genuine engagement that the institution's public legitimacy required. Diana was not that person, not because she lacked the intelligence or the will or the desire to be that person. She tried repeatedly and genuinely to be that person in the specific moments and contexts in which the institution's requirements were most clearly legible to her. She was not that person because her psychological makeup was fundamentally incompatible with the specific form of self-erasure that being that person required. She felt things intensely. The feeling was not a weakness in the context of the public life she was living, in the specific form of public engagement that she developed across her years as a public figure. The intensity of her feeling was her most powerful instrument. She could sit with people who were dying of AIDS in the years when AIDS was understood by most people as a disease of shame and isolation, and she could hold their hands and look at them with the specific quality of present, unguarded attention that communicated to the people who received it that their humanity was fully seen and fully valued. She could walk through a minefield in Angola in a face shield and body armor and communicate, by the quality of her presence in that place, that the people whose lives were endangered by what was buried in the ground beneath her feet were people whose danger she had personally decided to register in the most direct way available to her. These things were possible because she felt things intensely. The intensity was not a problem to be managed. It was the thing that made her, for the people who experienced it directly, one of the most genuinely connecting and genuinely present public figures of the 20th century. It was also the thing that made her, for the institution she had married into, one of the most difficult and most alarming people it had ever attempted to accommodate. The institution had no language for intensity that was expressed inwardly. It had language for intensity directed outward, the warmth, the engagement, the public composure, but only for intensity directed outward in the specifically managed, specifically bounded, specifically surface-maintaining way that the code required. Intensity that turned inward, that expressed itself in private, as distress or unhappiness, or the specific communication of feeling that intimate relationships ordinarily involve, was something the institution had no mechanism for receiving or responding to. The institution's response to this kind of intensity was the response it always gave to things that the code could not accommodate. It registered them as threats and responded with the mechanisms designed to manage threats. Diana experienced this as abandonment. The institution experienced it as management. The gap between these two experiences of the same set of events was irrecoverable, because the institution's response was, from within its own logic, entirely reasonable. It was managing a situation in the way the code required, and Diana's experience of the response was, from within her own logic, entirely reasonable. She was a person in distress who was not receiving adequate human response to her distress. Neither logic was wrong in its own terms. The two logics were simply incompatible, in the way that a person who needs warmth and a system that provides composure are incompatible, not because either is wrong, but because they are different things. The Queen Mother was the template for the system. She was the living proof that what system required was possible. She had spent 6 decades producing the warmth directed outward and managing the difficulty privately with a consistency and a thoroughness that made her the institution's most successful practitioner of its most essential art. When Diana arrived, the Queen Mother was 80 years old and had been demonstrating this art for 6 decades, demonstrating it so completely that it had come to seem not like a choice, but like a natural quality of the person who embodied it, which is the final form that the art takes when it has been practiced long enough. She was also, importantly, the person in the family who had the most direct experience of the kind of difficulty Diana was facing. She had supported a husband who had not wanted his role and who had struggled with its demands. She had maintained her composure through the abdication crisis and the war and the dissolution of the empire and her husband's early death. She understood, in ways that no one else in the family could quite understand in the same form, what it cost to maintain the surface when the reality behind the surface was painful. Diana wrote to her. This is established by the existence of the letters that were burned in 1993. The letters that covered, by all accounts, years of Diana's communication with the Queen Mother, years of seeking the advice and the support of the person in the family who might, Diana apparently believed, be best equipped to provide it. The Queen Mother responded with warmth. The warmth was genuine. The warmth was always genuine, because the warmth was the velvet and the velvet was real. The advice was also genuine, in the sense that it was the best advice the Queen Mother knew how to give. It was the advice that had governed her own life across a century. It was the advice that was, within the framework of the institution's requirements, the correct advice. It was the advice that would produce, for a person capable of following it, the outcomes the institution needed. Maintain the surface, keep the warmth visible and the difficulty private. Be an oyster. The advice was not wrong, for the kind of person the institution needed and for the kind of life the institution required. It was simply not advice that Diana was capable of following in the sustained and total way the institution required, not because she was unwilling, but because the cost of following it was a form of self-erasure that she was not equipped to sustain. The marriage to Charles deteriorated through the 1980s. By the early 1990s, the deterioration had passed beyond the point of manageable private difficulty into the territory of public acknowledgement. Both parties were contributing, through the separate channels available to them, to a narrative that made the state of the marriage legible to the press and through the press to the public. The cooperation with Andrew Morton that produced the 1992 book was, in institutional terms, the clearest and the most consequential of these contributions. The moment at which the private had been made publicly visible in a form institution recognized as severe, Diana was in a different position from Marion Crawford. Marion Crawford had been a person of no public standing outside the household, someone who could be erased from the institutional record because her erasure would not produce consequences in the public domain that the institution was not capable of managing. Diana was the mother of the heir to the throne, and she was one of the most publicly visible and most publicly beloved figures in the world. The erasure mechanisms that had worked for Marion Crawford were not available. What was available were the mechanisms that had been used against the Windsors, the mechanisms of formal designation, of working status, of the institutional management of a person's position within the circle, applied through channels that would be visible enough to communicate the institutional message and subtle enough to allow the institution to maintain, with the public, the face of a body that was acting from principle rather than from the management of a specific human inconvenience. The HRH was removed after the divorce in 1996. The working royal status was removed. The institution applied what it had, and what it had was toolkit that the Queen Mother had developed and maintained across 60 years of use, adapted to the specific constraints of a media environment that the original toolkit had not been designed for. Diana died on the 31st of August 1997 in Paris at the age of 36. She had been pursued by photographers through the streets of Paris at high speed in the early hours of the morning, and the car in which she was travelling had crashed in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel. The Queen Mother was 97 years old. She outlived Diana by nearly 5 years. The letters were already ash. The burning of Princess Diana's letters to the Queen Mother is, in the history of the 20th century British monarchy, the most significant act of deliberate historical record destruction that has been publicly documented. This is not a statement that requires qualification. No other single act of destruction has removed from the historical record a comparable quantity of primary documentation about the central relationships of the most publicly scrutinized and most historically significant family in the modern history of British public life. The letters covered, according to the accounts of people who were aware of their existence, at minimum a decade of Diana's direct, private, personal communication with the most senior female member of the family she had married into. They covered the years in which the marriage to Charles was deteriorating from difficult to impossible. They covered the years in which Diana's attempts to navigate the institutional culture she had married into were producing the distress that would eventually be made public through the Morton book and through the Panorama interview. They covered the years in which Diana was seeking guidance and support from the person in the family who had the most experience and the most standing to provide it. They covered, in all probability, the Queen Mother's responses, the replies to Diana's communications that would have been warm in their surface register, because the warmth was always real, and that would have communicated, beneath the warmth, the only advice the institution knew how to give. Too private and too dangerous. This was Princess Margaret's description of the letters. The phrase reported in William Shawcross's authorised biography of the Queen Mother, published in 2009, too private, the ordinary explanation, the one available in ordinary family terms, too dangerous, the other explanation, the one that carries the weight of what the institutional logic of the code had always required when confronted with documentation that complicated the approved account. Dangerous to whom? The answer requires working backward from the decision. The decision to burn the letters was made in 1993. It was made 4 years before Diana died. It was made 16 years before the biography that would reveal the burning was published. It was made at a time when the letters' existence was known to a limited number of people, and when their destruction could be accomplished quietly and completely. The letters were destroyed in advance of any public or legal process that might have established access to them. They were destroyed before Diana's cooperation with the Morton book had fully played out in the public domain. They were destroyed before the divorce, before the HRH removal, before the events of 1997. They were destroyed at the point where the person who destroyed them had assessed the risk of their survival against the risk of their destruction, and had concluded that the risk of their survival was the greater risk. What did the letters contain? that made their survival more dangerous than their destruction? The question cannot be answered with certainty because the letters do not exist. But the context allows for a reasoned account. The letters would have contained Diana's descriptions of her experiences within the institution, descriptions of the isolation, the loneliness, the depression, the inadequacy of the institutional response to her distress. These descriptions were not, by 1993, secret. The Morton book had already made Diana's account of her experiences public knowledge. What the letters would have added to the public account was not the content of Diana's experience, but the institution's documented response to that content. The Queen Mother's letters back to Diana, the replies, the guidance, the institutional advice communicated in the form of the warmth that was genuine and the principle that was also genuine and that produced, in combination, the specific form of response that the institution knew how to make to people who were in distress inside it. These were the dangerous part. Not because they would have shown the Queen Mother to be deliberately cruel or deliberately indifferent, but because they would have shown, in her own words, whether the institution's response to Diana's documented suffering was adequate, whether it offered anything beyond the institutional advice to maintain the surface and be an oyster, whether it acknowledged, even in the privacy of personal correspondence, that what was happening to Diana was something the institution bore any responsibility for or had any obligation to address. The answer implied by the decision to burn the letters is that they did not offer anything adequate, that they contained evidence, in the Queen Mother's own handwriting, in the specific words of the most senior female member of the family, of a response to a young woman's suffering that was, in the assessment of the person who destroyed them, not something the family could afford to have entered the historical record. This is the logic that had governed every previous instance in this account in which documentation that complicated the approved narrative had been encountered. Marion Crawford's private papers were not burned. Crawford was not inside the institution in the way that would have allowed the institution to access and destroy them, but the institution's response to the challenge they represented was the silence that made the papers difficult to act on while Crawford was alive. The Duke of Windsor's HRH requests were never documented in the form of a formal institutional response that acknowledged their merit. The institution's response was always the continued maintenance of the denial, which produced no documentation that could be used to argue that the denial had been reviewed and found wanting. The nieces were managed through the absence of a paper trail, no letters, no visits, no documented contact that would have created a record of the family's awareness of their existence, alongside a record of the family's decision not to engage with it. The letters were burned. Margaret was 73 years old. She had spent 73 years inside the institution. She had been formed by the institution as completely as her mother had been formed by it. Not as successfully, in the sense that the cost of the formation had been higher and the composure had cracked more frequently and more publicly, but as completely in the sense that the institutional logic had become, through 7 decades of immersion, her own logic. She knew the logic. She had lived inside it. She had felt it applied to herself in the matter of Peter Townsend, and she had made her statement on the 31st of October 1955, and she had lived with the consequences, and she had never, in the public record, attributed the consequences to the institutional pressure that had produced them. She burned the letters because she was the person the institution had made her into. Because the institution had given her, across 73 years, the capacity to recognize the situations that required the decision the code always made when confronted with documentation that complicated the approved account. Because she made the decision without hesitation, without apparent prolonged deliberation, in the manner of someone who knows what is required and does it, the destruction was complete. The letters were burned in 1993. Diana died in 1997. Margaret died in February 2002. The Queen Mother died in March 2002. 3 women, 3 deaths within 5 years, and the letters were already ash before any of them was gone. William Shawcross described the destruction as regrettable from a historical viewpoint. The British press, when the biography revealing it was published in 2009, used language considerably stronger. One commentator spoke of sitting with the knowledge that so much truth had simply been destroyed, that there was a decade of documentation about the most consequential relationships of the most consequential period in the recent history of the British monarchy that had been eliminated from the historical record before the historical record had the opportunity to preserve it. The surface remained smooth. That was the achievement. That was what the burning served. The surface that the Queen Mother had maintained across a century, smooth and warm and impenetrable, was maintained by the burning of the letters, because the letters were the thing that might most directly have demonstrated what lay beneath the surface and what the surface had been built to conceal. The velvet was for the crowds. The burning was for the historians. There is one further dimension of the burning that deserves attention, because it is the dimension that connects this specific act to the full account of the institutional logic this document has examined. The burning was not merely the destruction of evidence. It was the destruction of Diana's voice in the one context in which her voice had been most directly and most personally addressed to the institution. The context of private, personal, written communication with the person at the institution's senior female centre. Diana had many public voices. She had the voice of the public appearances and the royal engagements and the formal statements. She had the voice of the panorama interview, which was itself a form of institutional challenge. A woman speaking directly to the public over the heads of the institution in the specific manner the institution had always regarded as the most threatening form of disclosure. She had the voice of the Morton book, which had used her private account to produce a public narrative the institution could not contain. What she did not have, after 1993, was the private voice. The voice of the letters, the voice of a woman writing privately in confidence to the most senior woman in the family she had married into, in the expectation that what she communicated would be received with something approaching genuine human response. The letters were the context in which Diana had been most completely herself in her communications with the institution, unmediated, unmanaged, without the performance that the public context required. They were the context in which she had most directly asked for help, most directly communicated distress, most directly sought the kind of human acknowledgement that she needed and that the institution, in its public face, was always claiming to provide. The burning of the letters destroyed that voice completely. It destroyed the record of Diana's most direct and most personal communication with the institution, and it destroyed, simultaneously, the institution's written response to that communication. The record of what the Queen Mother had actually said in writing to a young woman who was suffering inside the institution. The Queen Mother had spent a century serving. Whatever those letters contained, whatever the Queen Mother had written back, it is gone. The private voice of both women in their most direct exchange is ash. This is not merely a loss to history in the abstract sense. It is the final application to Diana of the institutional logic that had governed the management of every inconvenient truth this account has examined. Marion Crawford's truth was managed through silence. The Windsor's truth was managed through protocol. The niece's truth was managed through absence. Diana's truth, the private truth of her communications with the institution's most powerful woman, was managed through fire. Different instruments, the same hand. What connects these stories is not malice in the ordinary sense. It is not the cruelty of someone who enjoyed causing pain, or who took deliberate pleasure in the suffering of the specific people on whom the institutional mechanism was applied. There is no serious evidence of that kind of personal sadism in any of the cases this account has examined. The Queen Mother was not a sadist. She was not a person who constructed elaborate schemes of revenge or who maintained silent campaigns of persecution for the pleasure of the persecution itself. The evidence does not support that account, and the evidence does not need to support it, because the account this document is making is a more precise, and in its own way, a more troubling account than sadism could provide. Sadism is recognizable. A person who takes pleasure in causing pain can be identified and named, and in principle, resisted or removed from the position that allows them to cause it. The resistance is possible because the cruelty is legible, because it can be pointed to, because it has a motivation that can be articulated, because the person on the receiving end can describe what is happening and be believed, at least by some of the people they describe it to. What this account has documented is something harder to identify, harder to name, and much harder to resist. It is institutional cruelty. The cruelty that occurs when an institution's requirements are applied to specific human situations without the kind of individual moral reasoning that would require examining whether the application is proportionate or just. The cruelty that occurs when a person has absorbed an institution's logic so completely that the institution's requirements feel like moral principles, feel like them genuinely, not as a performance or a self-justification, but as the actual moral reality of the situation, and the consequences of those requirements feel like justice rather than punishment, and the pain produced in the individuals on the receiving end is experienced not as a cost to be weighed and accounted for, but as a byproduct to be noted and set aside, because the principle that produced it is sound, and sound principles do not require revisions. Their application produces pain. The principle that the institution applied across all of these cases was the same principle: keep the private private, maintain the surface, ensure that the people who violate the code understand, through the consequences applied to them, that the code is real and that its enforcement is permanent, and that no accumulation of time or remorse or appeal to individual circumstances will produce its revision. This principle was, from the institution's perspective, not merely pragmatic but necessary. Necessary for the institution's survival in the specific sense that the institution's survival depended on the consistent management of its public presentation, and the consistent management of its public presentation depended on the consistent enforcement of the code that kept the private private. The institution's survival was, in the Queen Mother's fully absorbed understanding of her own purpose and her own life's work, the thing that mattered most. Not above everything, she loved her husband and her daughters, and she had genuine relationships with the people around her that were not merely instrumental. But the institution was the framework within which everything else operated, and the institution's survival was the precondition for everything else having the shape and the permanence that she had given her life to producing. She had made the total bargain. The total bargain required total enforcement. Marion Crawford had violated the code, not ambiguously, not in a way that required careful assessment of whether the violation met the threshold for the severe consequences. Clearly, publicly, in print, across an American magazine serialization and a book publication that had placed the private reality of the household in the most accessible public domain available. The code required consequences. The severity of the violation required the severest consequences available. The severest consequences available were the permanent ones. They were applied. The pain they produced for Marion Crawford over 38 years in Aberdeen was real. It was not the point. The point was the maintenance of the principle, and the maintenance of the principle was the deterrence of subsequent violations. And the deterrence of subsequent violations was the preservation of the code, and the preservation of the code was the preservation of the institution's capacity to manage its public presentation. And the preservation of that capacity was, in the logic the Queen Mother inhabited, the justification for everything. This logic is internally consistent. This is important to understand, because the internal consistency is what makes it so difficult to challenge. You cannot argue someone out of an internally consistent position by pointing to the pain it produces, because the logic has already accounted for the pain and found it acceptable. A necessary byproduct of a necessary principle. To challenge the positions you have to challenge the principle, and to challenge the principle you have to challenge the institution, and to challenge the institution from inside it is, by definition, the thing the institution has decided it cannot permit. The Duke of Windsor had violated the code in the most fundamental form available by demonstrating, publicly, irrevocably, at the highest possible level of visibility and consequence, that his personal happiness was more important to him than the institution's requirements. The code required that this demonstration be answered with consequences sufficiently severe and sufficiently permanent to communicate the institution's assessment of the demonstration. The consequences were applied and sustained. The pain they produced for the Duke and the Duchess across 36 years, and then across the 14 additional years of the Duchess's widowhood, was real. It was not the point. What is worth examining in the case of the Windsors is the specific mechanism through which the personal and the institutional were fused. The Queen Mother had genuine personal reasons to feel grievance against the Duke of Windsor. Reasons that were not fabricated or performed, but that were grounded in the real and documented fact that her husband had died at 56 from a burden the Duke's abdication had imposed. This is a real grievance. It deserves acknowledgement as a real grievance. A woman who watched her husband die young from an unchosen burden has legitimate grounds for the feelings that produces. The fusion occurred at the point where the legitimate personal grievance and the institutional logic that required permanent consequences for the violation met and became, through the Queen Mother's complete absorption of the institution's logic, indistinguishable. She did not experience them as separate things. She did not experience the HRH denial as, on one side, personal vindictiveness toward the woman whose love had cost her husband the throne, and on the other side, institutional principle requiring the demonstration that those who violated the code would face permanent consequences. She experienced them as one thing, as the correct and principled response to a violation that had produced genuine and lasting harm. The personal grievance gave the principle its emotional force. The institutional principle gave the personal grievance its justification. Together they produced something that felt, from the inside, like justice, and that looked, from the outside, like institutional principle in operation. This fusion is the most effective form of institutional cruelty because it is the form most resistant to challenge. The person applying it is not acting from vindictiveness. They genuinely believe they are acting from principle. The institution supporting it is not acting from malice. It genuinely believes it is enforcing necessary requirements. And the people on the receiving end find themselves in the position of arguing that a principle is being unjustly applied, which requires the people applying it to acknowledge that the principle's application can be unjust, which the fusion of personal conviction and institutional logic makes impossible. The nieces had not violated the code. This is the case in this account that most clearly demonstrates the steel in its passive rather than its active form, and it is worth dwelling on because passive cruelty is in certain respects more difficult to characterize and more difficult to address than active cruelty. Active cruelty is the application of consequences to a person who has done something. Passive cruelty is the sustained withholding of something from a person who has done nothing. The withholding of contact, of acknowledgement, of the basic recognition that a person exists and is present in the world and is owed the minimal forms of human attention that relationship and blood entitle them to expect. Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon had done nothing. They had not violated any code, had not crossed any line, had not made any choice that the institution could identify as a transgression requiring consequences. They were simply there, in a Surrey institution, 2 hours from London, for 6 decades, and their being there was inconvenient in the specific institutional sense that the code required certain things to remain absent from the surface, and their existence was one of those things. Not because their disability was shameful in any honest assessment, it was not. Not because the institutional care they received was deliberately cruel, it was not. But because families committed to the public projection of service and dignity and warmth did not, in the era and the class in which the Queen Mother had been formed, publicly acknowledge the existence of members who could not participate in the service and the dignity and the warmth. The private must remain private, the surface must be smooth. The things that complicated the surface were managed through sustained absence. The sustained absence applied across 6 decades to 2 women who could not advocate for themselves, and could not document what they were missing, and could not communicate to anyone outside the institution what the absence meant to them. This is the steel in its most passive and its most complete form. No decision was required day by day to maintain it. No active effort was needed to keep them invisible. The invisibility was maintained by the simple continuation of the absence that had been established when they were placed in the institution in 1941. Each day the absence continued. The absence became more thoroughly the default. Each year the correction to Burke's peerage was not made. The inaccuracy became more deeply embedded in the record. Each decade that passed without a visit, the visiting became less possible to imagine. not because any active barrier had been erected, but because the gap had grown so wide that crossing it would have required acknowledging, by the crossing, that the gap had existed and had been maintained and had been the choice of the person who had chosen not to cross it. The acknowledgement was not made. The gap was not crossed. They were there for 61 and 73 years, and the woman who shared their blood was alive for all of it and never came. Princess Margaret had not violated the code. She had been placed in the position of choosing between what she wanted and what the institution required, and she had been formed by the institution sufficiently completely that she had made the choice the institution required. The pain produced in her by that choice, not in the moment of making it, not on the 31st of October 1955 when the statement was read and the choice was public, and the relief of having finally made it might have temporarily outweighed the grief of what had been given up. But in the 47 years that followed, in the accumulated weight of the life that had been chosen instead, in the specific kind of loss that arrives not as a single blow, but as a recurring recognition that the thing you most wanted is the thing you were prevented from having, this pain was real and it was ongoing, and it was the direct product of the institutional logic that the Queen Mother had embodied and transmitted. The code had not been applied to Margaret in the sense of consequences imposed for a transgression. The code had been applied to her in the sense of requirements communicated through the consistent modelling of what the institution needed, requirements that she had absorbed so completely that when the choice came, she made the institutional choice rather than the personal one, and spent the rest of her life carrying the weight of having made it. This is the most insidious form of the code's operation. The person on the receiving end is not the victim of consequences imposed for something they did. They are the product of a formation process that has made them into someone who does what the institution requires, without experiencing it as compulsion, because the formation has been thorough enough that the institution's requirements feel like their own convictions, and the choice they make is experienced as their own choice, and the pain that results is experienced as the natural consequence of their own decision rather than as the product of the institutional logic that shaped the decision into the form it took. Diana had violated the code, and the code's response to her violation was in certain respects the clearest demonstration of how the logic operated in its active form. The response was calibrated, not the total erasure that Marion Crawford had experienced, because Diana's position made total erasure impossible, but the application of the mechanisms that were available. The divorce, the working royal status removal, the HRH. Each mechanism was, in the institutional logic, a principled response to a specific transgression. The divorce responded to the demonstrated impossibility of the marriage. The working royal status removal responded to Diana's demonstrated unwillingness to observe the institutional requirements of that status. The HRH removal responded to the established precedent that people who were considered outside the circle did not carry the designation that marked full membership of it. Each individual mechanism taken in isolation could be justified on institutional grounds. The justification was the institutional logic, applied without individual moral reasoning about the specific person to whom it was being applied, or the specific context in which it was operating. Applied as it had always been applied, because the code required it, and the principle was sound, and the pain it produced in the individual was a byproduct rather than the point. There is a question that the full account of these cases raises, and that deserves to be asked directly, even if it cannot be answered with the precision the asking might seem to require. The question is whether the Queen Mother knew, not in the institutional sense of having absorbed and applied the code, which she clearly did, but in the individual human sense of having, at some level of consciousness, recognized that what she was doing to specific people was causing them harm that was disproportionate to what they had done. The available evidence does not allow a definitive answer. What it allows is a range of probabilities. At one end, she knew in the full human sense that Marion Crawford was suffering in Aberdeen, and that the Windsors were suffering in their exile, and that her daughter was carrying a weight that would compress into the 47 years that followed October 1955. And she applied the code regardless, because the institutional logic she had absorbed told her that the suffering was the consequence of the transgression, and the transgression required consequence. At the other end, she did not know, in any fully conscious human sense, because the institutional formation had been so complete that the individual human lives to which the code was being applied were not visible to her as individual human lives in the way they would have been visible to someone who had not undergone that formation. They were categories: the woman who published, the couple who abdicated, the daughter who wanted to marry a divorced man, and the code addressed categories, not individuals, and the addressing of categories produced consequences that fell on individuals, and the fall of those consequences on those individuals was not something the institutional logic had a mechanism for registering as a cost. The truth is probably neither end and both ends simultaneously. A human being of genuine warmth and genuine intelligence could not have been entirely unaware that specific people were suffering from specific decisions she had sustained. The warmth was real, and the intelligence was real, and both were capacities for human recognition that do not simply switch off in the direction of specific individuals. But the institutional formation was also real, and it was complete, and it had produced in her a settled conviction that what the institution required was right, not probably right, not right on balance, but simply right, in the way that things you have absorbed as moral principle rather than as institutional imperative feel right. Settled conviction of rightness is one of the most effective mechanisms available for the management of awareness of suffering that might otherwise require the revision of a decision. You can know someone is suffering and still believe the suffering is the consequence of their own choices, and therefore not the cost of a decision you have made, but the cost of a decision they have made. You can hold both things, the awareness of the suffering and the conviction of the rightness of the principle, without the holding of both, producing the revision that the awareness of the suffering might otherwise require. This is the internal life of institutional cruelty, not the absence of human feeling. The presence of human feeling managed through the framework of institutional conviction in ways that prevent the feeling from producing the action that ordinary human feeling, without that management, would produce. The steel hand was not visible from the street. The institutional logic was not visible from the street. The warmth was what the street saw, and the warmth was real, and the realness of the warmth was the most complete and the most durable protection the steel hand ever had. It would be dishonest, having examined the steel with the attention this account has given it, to not give full and serious attention to the velvet. The velvet was not the steel in a different material. It was not the same quality expressed in a softer register. It was a genuinely different thing, a genuine quality of warmth and genuine capacity for human connection that produced, across a century of consistent deployment, a form of public love that was among the most remarkable achievements in the history of the modern British monarchy. The wartime years are where the velvet was most completely genuine and where its deployment produced consequences that were most historically significant. To understand why the public love of the Queen Mother was so deep and so durable, you have to understand what happened in the years between September 1940 and May 1945, and you have to understand it in the specific terms of what it meant to the people who lived through it, not merely in the terms that the subsequent historical record has tended to produce. Britain in September 1940 was a country in a condition that is difficult to fully convey to people who did not live through it. The fall of France in June 1940 had produced a military situation that was, in the most straightforward objective assessment, desperate. The country stood alone against a continental power that had overrun every opposing army that had faced it. The United States had not yet entered the war. The Commonwealth allies were distant. The Channel was narrow. The German Air Force had begun its systematic attempt to destroy the Royal Air Force, and if that attempt succeeded, the invasion the Channel was currently preventing would become possible. The Blitz began in September 1940 as a shift in German strategy from the destruction of the RAF to the destruction of civilian morale. The bombs fell first on the East End of London, on the docks and the industries and the most densely populated and the least well-protected parts of a city that had, until that moment, been a civilian target in a war that civilians had always understood they might eventually be part of, but had not, until the first nights of September 1940, been required to live inside in the most immediate and the most physical sense. The bombs fell on the East End, and they also, on the 13th of September, fell on Buckingham Palace. There were, by various accounts, either 2 or 9 incidents of bombs striking the palace or its grounds during the war. The exact number matters less than the public significance of the fact. The palace had been hit. The King and Queen had been present in London. The bombs had fallen, and the King and Queen had remained. The Queen Mother's remark about now being able to look the East End in the face, expressed in various versions across various accounts, but expressing a sentiment that was consistent and that was understood by the people who heard it to be genuine, was the compressed expression of something she had understood about the institution and its relationship to the people it represented. The institution's legitimacy depended on the public's belief that the people inside it shared, at some level, the conditions and the risks of the people they represented. For most of the institution's history, this had been a comfortable fiction. The people inside the institution did not share the conditions of the people outside it, but the separation was managed through ritual and ceremony and the specific forms of public engagement that communicated symbolic solidarity without requiring actual shared experience. The Blitz ended the comfortable fiction. The people of the East End were in the rubble of their homes, and they needed to know that the people who were asking them to endure this were not safely removed from it in ways that made the asking itself a form of insult. The palace bombing was not catastrophic. The palace survived, and the King and Queen were not injured. But it was real. The bombs had fallen there too. The King and Queen had not fled. The symbolic solidarity had been given a physical reality, and the Queen Mother had understood, with the specific social intelligence that was her most reliable instrument, that the physical reality was the thing that would make everything else possible. She and the King visited the bombed areas throughout the Blitz. They came to the streets where the houses had been reduced to rubble, and the people who had lived in those houses were sitting in the wreckage, trying to understand what their lives had become. They came without the ceremony that the institution usually deployed, without the elaborate preparation and the managed distance of formal state occasions. They came, as nearly as was possible given what they were and what they represented, as people rather than as symbols. They walked through the rubble. They talked to the people in the rubble. They looked at faces, and they responded to what they saw in those faces, with the quality of attention that the Queen Mother had been developing and deploying since childhood. The quality of attention is the specific thing that made these visits different from the visits a less gifted public performer would have made, and that would not have produced the same effect. Most public figures, when they visit people in distress, produce a version of attention that the people they are visiting experience as performed, as the performance of concern rather than genuine concern, as going through the expected motions of the expected responses, rather than as being actually present to what the situation contains. The Queen Mother produced consistently and across her entire public life the opposite of this. She was present in the way that people are present when they are genuinely attending to what is in front of them, rather than managing their own responses to it. The people she talked to felt this. They felt in the specific and irreplaceable way that you feel when someone is actually listening rather than merely appearing to listen, that they were being seen. The wartime visits generated a form of public trust that the institution had not previously possessed in the same quality and the same quantity. Not trust in the abstract sense of confidence that the institution would operate efficiently or that its formal constitutional functions would be performed reliably. Trust in the human sense, the trust that a person develops for another person who has sat with them in a moment of genuine distress and communicated by the quality of their presence that the distress was seen and that the person in the distress was real. This form of trust cannot be manufactured. It cannot be produced by communication professionals or by carefully scripted public appearances or by any of the mechanisms that modern public relations has developed for the management of public perception. It can only be produced by genuine human presence, by a person who actually possesses the capacity to be present in the way the Queen Mother possessed it, deployed in situations where the need for that presence is real, and the people who receive it are in conditions that make them acutely sensitive to the difference between genuine presence and its performance. She had the capacity. The situations were real. The generation that experienced the wartime visits received something that formed their relationship to the institution and to the person at the center of those visits in a way that was qualitatively different from anything subsequent engagement with the institution could produce. They did not merely know the Queen Mother as a public figure. They had been to the rubble with her. They had felt the quality of her attention in the specific, irreplaceable form that genuine distress, genuinely received, produces. They carried this in a way that subsequent decades of public appearances at race meetings and garden parties could not dilute, because it had been received at the level of direct human experience rather than at the level of mediated public image. The institution understood this. The institution had always understood, in its bones if not always in its explicit reasoning, that the legitimacy that mattered most was not the formal constitutional legitimacy of royal authority, but the informal human legitimacy of a family that people genuinely loved because they had genuine reasons to love it. The Queen Mother's contribution to this informal legitimacy was the most substantial in the modern history of the monarchy, and the wartime years were where that contribution was most indelibly established. The post-war years produced their own version of the relationship. The austerity of the late 1940s and the 1950s, the rationing, the reconstruction, the specific grey exhaustion of a country that had survived something enormous and now had to build something new from the surviving pieces, was a condition in which the warmth the Queen Mother produced at public occasions had a specific and continuing function. The garden parties and the race meetings and the regimental dinners and the hospital visits were not luxuries or irrelevancies in a world of genuine post-war austerity. They were the occasions on which the institution communicated to the people of the country that the things worth preserving, the warmth, the continuity, the genuine human connection across class and condition, had survived the war and were available, in the specific form the institution could provide them, to the people who needed them. The aging of the wartime generation did not diminish the public love. If anything, the love became more concentrated as the people who had experienced the wartime visits aged, and as their memories of those visits became part of a personal history that was increasingly distant from the present, but remained, as the most emotionally charged memories always remain, more vivid and more present to consciousness than many things that had happened much more recently. They had been in the rubble with her. They remembered it. The pastel hat and the focused smile at the garden party in 1975 or 1985 or 1995 activated, in the people who had been in the rubble, the memory of the woman who had been there with them, and the warmth they felt in response was the warmth of that memory as much as the warmth of the public occasion itself. The younger generations who had not been in the rubble received a different version of the same quality. They encountered the warmth at public occasions, at the race meetings and the garden parties and the birthday portraits, and they encountered it through the stories of parents and grandparents who had experienced it in conditions that had given it its most meaningful form. The intergenerational transmission of the wartime quality, the specific love that the Blitz visits had generated, transmitted across decades through family stories and public memory, and the consistent reinforcing presence of the woman at its center, produced a form of public love that was, by the time of her death, as deep and as widely distributed as any that the institution had ever achieved. The velvet that the steel hand was encased in was not a thin covering. It was real, and it was deep, and it had been built across a century of a consistent, genuine, skilled deployment of the quality that happened to be exactly what the institution most needed, and that the woman who possessed it most completely had devoted herself, with total and considered commitment, to providing. She had understood the relationship between the performance of warmth and the love it produces. She had worked at that relationship for a century. She had understood that warmth, consistently and genuinely deployed across an entire public life, produces a kind of love that is not merely the sum of the individual occasions on which it was deployed, but something cumulative and qualitative, something that becomes, over time, a settled conviction in the public mind that the person who produced it is fundamentally good, and that this goodness is real, and that the institution they represent is, by virtue of their goodness, trustworthy. This settled conviction was the institution's most valuable asset in the second half of the 20th century. More valuable than the constitutional arrangements, more valuable than the formal ceremonies, more valuable than the accumulated pageantry of the occasions of state that marked the passage of the decades. It was the thing that allowed the institution to survive the abdication crisis and the austere post-war years and the social transformations of the 1960s and the Republican challenges of the 1970s and the difficulties of the 1980s and the various and serious challenges of the 1990s, to survive them not merely intact, but in most cases strengthened by the survival. The velvet built this asset. It built it across a century. It was real. The steel was also real. Both columns, always both columns. She died on the 30th of March 2002, and the institution she had shaped across a century continued to operate after her death with the logic she had embodied. It continued to apply the code, to maintain the surface, to enforce the invisible line with the consistency and the skill and the velvet-covered precision that had characterized its enforcement throughout her lifetime. The specific instruments she had wielded, the silence, the protocol manipulation, the HRH designation, continued to be available to the institution and continued to be used, adapted to the specific circumstances of the specific people and the specific challenges each new decade produced. The inheritance operated in several dimensions simultaneously. The most visible dimension was the precedential one. The cases this account has examined had established, for the institution and for everyone who had observed the institution's conduct with sufficient attention to understand what they were observing, a set of precedents about what happened when certain kinds of violations occurred. Marion Crawford's case established the precedent for how the palace dealt with people who made the private visible through publication. The Windsor case established the precedent for the management of people who had been decided were permanently outside the circle, including the specific mechanism of the HRH designation as a tool for communicating that positioning. The destruction of Diana's letters established the precedent for the management of documentation that complicated the approved account. Each precedent was, in the institutional logic, not a precedent, but simply the correct application of a principle. And because it was understood as the correct application of a principle, rather than as a case-specific decision, it remained available to be applied again when the next case that resembled it sufficiently arose. The most important dimension of the inheritance was the dispositional one. The Queen Mother had, across a century of institutional formation and 6 decades of institutional seniority, shaped the people around her into people who shared her understanding of what the institution required, and who had absorbed the institutional logic sufficiently completely that the logic operated through them, as it had operated, not as a set of conscious decisions about how to apply specific rules, but as the settled, unexamined understanding of what situations required that comes from deep and extended immersion in the values and the operating assumptions of the world you inhabit. Princess Margaret was the clearest example. She had burned the letters in 1993, not because she had been instructed to burn them, or because she had made a carefully reasoned decision that the destruction of the letters was, on balance, the optimal course of action. She had burned them because she was the person the institution had made her into, and the institution had made her into a person for whom the recognition of the situation as one requiring this response was immediate and unambiguous. The formation had been complete enough that the decision required no extended deliberation. It required the recognition that this was a situation the code addressed, and the institution had given her, across 73 years, the capacity to make that recognition. This is how institutional inheritances operate most effectively, not through the explicit transmission of rules that the next generation consciously applies, through the formation of people who have absorbed the institution's logic so completely that the logic operates as their own instinct and conviction. The rules are never needed because the people who have been formed by the institution do not experience themselves as following rules. They experience themselves as acting on their own convictions, which happen to be the convictions the institution required them to have. The inheritance was also visible in the specific cases that arose after her death, and that demonstrated the continuation of the institutional logic in operation. The treatment of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle in the years following their marriage in 2018 is the most extensively documented of these cases and the one that has received the most contemporary public attention. The specific mechanisms deployed were different from the mechanisms deployed in earlier cases. The media environment of the 21st century had transformed both the tools available to the institution and the tools available to the people. The institution was applying pressure to, in ways that fundamentally altered the landscape in which the institutional logic operated. The silence that had worked for Marion Crawford in 1950 could work for Meghan Markle in 2020 because the silence depended on the person being silenced having limited access to platforms through which they could produce their own account, and Meghan Markle had access to platforms, to global media, to social media, to streaming services willing to pay substantial sums for the accounts of people who had been inside royal institutions and were prepared to describe what they had seen there that Marion Crawford had not had, and that made the silence not merely ineffective but counterproductive. The logic was the same. The diagnosis was the same. A person had made the private visible, or had been perceived as planning to make the private visible, or had been perceived as constitutionally inclined to make the private visible in ways the institution could not manage. The code required a response. The response was calibrated to the tools available in the current context. The velvet was directed outward, toward the public, maintaining the institution's face. The steel was applied through the channels available, institutional positioning, the management of access and proximity, the specific forms of exclusion and pressure that are available to an institution that retains significant influence over the material conditions of the people who are part of it. The institution was applying, in 2018 and 2019 and 2020, a logic it had developed and practiced for decades, a logic whose most consistent practitioner had died in 2002, but whose methods had been absorbed so completely by the institution that they no longer required her presence to operate. The institution had become what she had made it. The making had been so thorough that her death was not the ending of anything, but the continuation of everything she had built, applied now by people who had learned from her directly, or from the people who had learned from her directly, in an environment that was recognizably different from the one she had inhabited, but recognizably continuous with the one she had shaped. The Castle of May stands in Caithness, in the furthest north of the Scottish mainland, looking out across the Pentland Firth, toward the Orkney Islands in weather, that is, for much of the year, violent enough to make the building's continued existence feel like a minor act of defiance against the conditions. The Queen Mother had first seen it in 1952, the year of her husband's death, on a visit to friends in the north of Scotland. The castle was, at that point, in severe disrepair and under consideration for demolition. She had bought it. She had restored it, over years of careful attention and genuine enthusiasm, into a habitable and eventually comfortable house that she used for several weeks each year as a private retreat, and that she eventually transferred to a charitable trust, the Queen Elizabeth Castle of May Trust, that preserved it as a working estate with public access. The restoration was genuine. The enthusiasm was genuine. The specific quality of pleasure she took in having rescued something that would otherwise have been lost. The preservation instinct, the understanding that the things worth keeping do not preserve themselves, but require the active engagement of people who understand their value, is visible in the accounts of people who were present for the restoration years, and who describe a woman who took genuine, specific, non-performative pleasure in the work. This is the velvet in its private form, the genuine quality that operated not for public benefit or institutional advantage, but simply because it was the quality of the person, expressed in the specific context of a house in Caithness that she loved and that she chose to save, because the saving of it gave her pleasure, and because she understood what would be lost if no one saved it. The racing world she inhabited for 5 decades was another of the private pleasures that were genuinely private, that she pursued not for institutional reasons, but because she genuinely loved horse racing in the specific, deep, detailed way that people who have grown up near horses and who have spent decades attending races develop. She was knowledgeable. She was enthusiastic. She was capable of genuine excitement at the outcome of a race, in a way that the people who observed her at the racecourses found entirely convincing because it was entirely genuine. The pleasures of the private life were real. The Castle of May was real. The racing was real. The friendships across 5 decades with writers and painters and musicians, and the particular range of people whose company she chose for its own sake rather than for its institutional utility were real. These things were part of the same person who had maintained 38 years of silence in Aberdeen, and who had applied the HRH denial across 60 years, and who had shaped the institution's management of people who crossed the line in ways that outlasted her by decades. The same person, the warmth and the steel, both real, both consistent, both deployed with the skill of a woman who had spent a century understanding exactly how the world she inhabited worked and what it required of the people inside it. The legacy she left was everything she had built: the institutional capital, the precedents, the operating assumptions, the specific form of the code's enforcement, and also the specific things she had done and the specific damage they had produced, and the specific people who had paid the cost. The assessment of the legacy requires both. It requires the acknowledgement that what she built was real and that it mattered, and that it contributed to the survival and the pub trust of an institution that has been, whatever its costs, a significant presence in the public life of the country across 4 centuries. It also requires the acknowledgement that the building produced damage that was not incidental to the building, but was intrinsic to the method of building, that the maintenance of the code was not a side effect of the public service, but was, in the most direct sense, the institution's primary mechanism for managing the conditions of its own survival, and that the people on the receiving end of the code's enforcement were not collateral damage in the pursuit of a larger public good, but the human cost of a specific institutional choice about how to organize and protect and perpetuate a body of power. The human dimension of the inheritance is the dimension that the official account has always been least interested in examining, and that this account has been most interested in. The official account of a legacy is interested in what was built: the institutions, the public trust, the precedents of service, the demonstrated model of a life committed to the public good across a century of consistent application. These are real things. They deserve acknowledgement. The human dimension of the inheritance is the people, not the abstract category of people who benefited from the institution's survival and who were warmed by the warmth directed at them from the garden parties and the race meetings and the bombed streets. The specific people who were on the receiving end of the code. Marion Crawford, who spent 38 years in Aberdeen and died without a word. Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Leon, who spent decades in a Surrey institution without a visit. The Duchess of Windsor, who spent 50 years without 3 letters before her name. Princess Margaret, who spent 47 years carrying a weight the institution had given her and never acknowledged. Diana, whose private voice was burned in 1993 and whose death in 1997 left the burning permanently unreversed. These people are the human dimension of the inheritance. They are the specific, named, documented individuals whose lives were shaped by the institutional logic the Queen Mother embodied and applied. Their stories are recoverable, imperfectly, from the fragments the historical record has preserved, from the private papers left with her solicitor, from the genealogical research that uncovered the Surrey institution, from the authorised biography that disclosed the burning of the letters. They are recoverable because the people who lived them were real, and the damage done to them was real, and the historical record, however carefully managed, cannot be managed completely. The inheritance includes these people. The accounting requires them. The accounting requires both columns. The inheritance was both. It is the 30th of March 2002. The flowers are accumulating at the gates of Royal Lodge, Windsor, in the hours after the announcement. The queues are forming at the books of condolence. The television broadcasts are running through the night. The country is grieving for a woman who had been, for most of the people doing the grieving, the warmest and the most approachable and the most genuinely human presence the institution had offered them across their lifetimes. The woman who had been in the bombed streets, who had smiled at the camera for a century, who had demonstrated across 101 years of public life that warmth and service and genuine human engagement were not merely institutional performances but qualities of a real person who had given a real life to their expression. Marion Crawford's death in 1988 is already 14 years in the past. She died without a word from the palace, without the acknowledgement that her 17 years of service to the two girls she had loved might have entitled her to expect, without the restoration of any part of the connection that the code had severed when her book was published. She died in the Aberdeen house at the age of 77, with the silence that had been established in 1950 fully in place. The woman who established it was still alive. She had 14 more years. The silence outlasted Marion Crawford entirely, and the woman who had maintained it used those 14 years without any gesture toward the acknowledgement that would have cost nothing publicly, and that might have communicated to the historical record that the relationship had been understood, from at least one side, as something more than a contract with a penalty clause. She did not communicate this. The silence was the communication. It had been the communication since 1950, and it remained the communication, permanent and absolute, until Marion Crawford's death made its permanence retroactive. Nerissa Bowes-Lyon's death in 1986 is 16 years in the past. She was buried in an unmarked grave at Red Hill Cemetery. The grave is still unmarked at the time of this death. It will be marked eventually, when the investigation of 1987 produces the public knowledge that makes the absence of a marker itself a form of public statement requiring a response. But the marking will be done not by the family but by the institution that cared for her, which is itself a kind of statement about who understood themselves to be responsible for her. The Queen Mother is still alive. She will outlive Nerissa by 16 years. She will not arrange for the marking of the grave. She will not, so far as the available record shows, make any gesture toward the acknowledgement of Nerissa's existence that Nerissa's death might have been expected to prompt. Catherine Bowes-Lyon is still alive. She is 75 years old. She has been in institutional care for 61 years. She will remain in institutional care for another 12 years. She will outlive the Queen Mother by 12 years. She will die in 2014 at the age of 87, having spent 73 years in the Surrey institution, and her death will pass without public acknowledgement from the royal family, just as her life, across its entire length, has passed without documented contact from the royal family. The Duchess of Windsor's death in 1986 is 16 years in the past. She died without the HRH that her husband had spent the last decades of his life requesting, and that he had raised, from his deathbed, in the final conversation he was capable of sustaining with a member of his family. She died positioned, in the formal institutional record, as Her Grace the Duchess of Windsor. The adjacent but lesser designation that had been established for her in 1937 and maintained, across 50 years, against every argument for its revision. The Queen Mother had outlived her by 16 years and had not used those 16 years to produce the posthumous resolution that the Duke had spent his life requesting. The denial was as complete at the moment of the Queen Mother's own death as it had been at the moment of the Duke's. Princess Margaret is dying. She has been in poor health across the final year of her life, with a series of strokes and declining overall health that has produced a gradual and distressing diminishment of the vivacity that had been one of her most consistent qualities. She will die 6 weeks after her mother, on the 9th of February 2002, having lived 61 years as the sister of the Queen and 47 years with the weight of the statement she made on the 31st of October 1955. She has burned the letters. She has done what the institution required. She has done it in the manner that the institution's most thorough formation produces, without apparent hesitation, without apparent prolonged deliberation, because she was, after 73 years, the person the institution had made her. Diana's letters burned in 1993. The questions they might have answered are permanently unanswerable. The woman who wrote them died in Paris in 1997 at the age of 36. The woman who burned them is dying, 6 weeks away from her own death. The woman they were written to is dead today, on the 30th of March 2002, at Royal Lodge, Windsor. 3 women, 3 deaths within 5 years of each other, and the correspondence between them. the decade of personal letters that documented the most consequential private relationships of the most consequential period in the recent history of the British monarchy. Was ash before any of them was gone, ash in 1993, ash when Diana died in 1997, ash today when the Queen Mother dies, and the questions the letters might have answered become permanently, definitively unanswerable. These are the facts of the private version of this life. They sit alongside the facts of the public version. The Blitz and the bombed streets and the 50 years of garden parties and the 8 decades of focused smile and genuine warmth and a century of service to an institution that was, genuinely, better for her service to it, and they do not cancel those facts. They are not the exposure of the warmth as a fraud. They are not the demonstration that the service was performed cynically or that the love the public felt was manufactured from a cold and calculating base. The service was real, the love was earned, the warmth was genuine. The facts of the private versions are simply the other column. They are the column the official account has always been interested in not examining. They are the column that sits alongside the column of public achievement and asks to be set next to it and held there, simultaneously, without the resolution into a simpler and more comfortable account that the simultaneous holding prevents. Hugo Vickers spent 17 years on the research. He arrived, after 17 years and 4 decades of observation, at the steel hand in the velvet glove. It is the most precise formulation of the full picture that the available record has produced. Both parts are necessary, neither part alone is the picture. The steel hand, the velvet glove, both real, both consistent, both deployed with the skill of a woman who had spent a century learning exactly how power worked in the world she inhabited, and who had absorbed that world's logic so completely that its requirements and her own convictions had become, through the total and lifelong fusion that the total bargain she had made in 1923 required, exactly the same thing. She was not a hypocrite. A hypocrite claims to be what they are not. She was exactly what she appeared to be, to the public who encountered the warmth, and exactly what she appeared to be to the people who encountered the steel. The velvet was not a disguise for the steel. The steel was not a hidden reality beneath the velvet. They were both the reality simultaneously, operating in different directions for different purposes toward different people. The warmth was for the crowds. The steel was for the people who had crossed the line. The line was drawn by the institution she had joined in 1923, drawn long before she arrived, in the accumulated logic and practice of an institution that had been managing its own survival and its own public presentation for centuries. She had not drawn the line, she had enforced it. She had enforced it across century, with the consistency and the thoroughness and the skill of who had absorbed the institution's logic so completely that the enforcement was indistinguishable, from her perspective and from the perspective of the institution she served, from principle, from the natural and inevitable and morally required application of what an institution committed to the maintenance of a certain kind of public trust, owed to that trust and to the people who depended on it. The people who depended on it were the public. The public had been given the warmth and had loved it and had loved her. The public was not wrong to love her. The warmth was real and the service was real, and the contribution to the institution's survival across a century that included 2 world wars and a Great Depression and the dissolution of the empire and the social transformations that followed was real and was significant. The people who paid for the maintenance of the thing the public loved were the other people. The ones in Aberdeen, the one in the Surrey institution, the one in the Paris house, the one in the statement of the 31st of October, the ones in the ash of the letters. They paid in the specific, private, sustained currency that the maintenance of the code always extracts, in years and in silence, and in the sustained absence of the acknowledgement and the contact and the recognition that human beings are owed by the people who share their blood and their world and their lives. The full accounting requires both columns. It requires the acknowledgement of what was built and what it was worth and what it cost in the specific, human, irrecoverable terms of the lives of the people who paid the cost. It also requires the acknowledgement of what the accounting itself is for, because the point of looking at both columns is not to arrive at a verdict but to resist the seduction of the single column. The public version of this life is seductive because it is genuinely good. The century of service is real. The warmth is real. The Blitz visits were real, and they mattered, and they produced consequences that outlasted them across generations. The person who stood in the bombed streets and spoke to the women of the East End was not performing solidarity. She was embodying it with genuine skill and genuine feeling in conditions that demanded both and that she provided both. This is worth defending against the version of this account that would make the steel the whole story and the velvet merely its cover. The velvet was not a cover, it was its own reality. The warmth produced across a century was not extracted from a hollow or a cold or a deliberately constructed core. It was produced from a genuine and consistent and deeply human quality of attention that most people do not possess in the form she possessed it, and that she deployed across a century for the benefit of the people who received it. They were right to love her. The love was earned. The private version of this life is also seductive, in its own way, seductive in the direction of reductiveness rather than sentimentality, seductive toward the account that would make the steel the truth and the velvet the illusion. This account is also wrong. Marion Crawford's 38 years in Aberdeen are real. And they are wrong, and they deserve to be named as wrong. The Duchess of Windsor's 60-year HRH denial is real and disproportionate, and deserves to be named as disproportionate. The niece's 6 decades without a visit are real, and represent a sustained moral failure that the contextualization of the era cannot fully explain. Princess Margaret's 47 years with the weight of October 1955 are real, and represent the cost extracted by an institution from a person it had formed into someone who could not resist what it required. These are all true, and the warmth is also true, and the service is also true, and the love the country felt, and the grounds on which it felt, it are also true. The steel hand in the velvet glove is the phrase that holds both truths simultaneously. It does not resolve them. It does not privilege one over the other. It names the thing that is hardest to name, the person whose genuine warmth and whose genuine cruelty were not in contradiction with each other, because they were not in competition with each other. They operated in different directions toward different people, for different purposes. They were both real. They were both consistent, and they were both hers. This is what a century of institutional formation produces in a person who has given themselves to it completely. Not a hypocrite, not a person of hidden cruelty concealed beneath a performed warmth. A person whose warmth is genuine in the direction it flows, and whose steel is genuine in the direction it flows, and who has been made, by a century of total institutional belonging, into someone for whom these two things do not feel like a contradiction, because the institution she served never acknowledged that they were. The institution acknowledged neither. It acknowledged only the velvet. The steel was the thing that made the velvet possible. The mechanism by which the surface was maintained against the people, and the facts that would have disturbed it, and the institution, in all the decades of the Queen Mother's service to it, and all the decades that followed her death, has never fully accounted for the cost of the maintenance. This account has attempted the accounting, not the final accounting, that is not available because the letters are ash, and the visits were never made, and the silences cannot be reconstructed, and the full interior lives of the people who lived inside these stories are not recoverable from the fragments the historical record has preserved, but the accounting of the record that exists, the column of what was built and the column of what it cost. She was 101 years old, and the country loved her. The steel hand was not visible from the street. It was never visible from the street. That was the achievement of a lifetime. That was also the cost. And the cost was paid, as costs applied by the powerful to the powerless are always paid, not by the person who applied them, but by the people the surface was built to make invisible, in the quiet, in the private, in the decades, in the sustained and irrevocable absence of the acknowledgement that no number of flowers at the gates of Royal Lodge, accumulated across all the days of all the years, could ever be said to have replaced. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.